right, perfect. The committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an open statement. Today is our committee's second hearing on the skyrocketing prices of prescription drugs. At our first hearing in January, the committee's very first witness, Ms. Antoinette Worsham, she was a compelling witness. Her 22-year-old daughter died because she could not afford the insulin she needed to control her diabetes. By the way, the insulin costs $333 a month. Let that sink in. For $333 a month. 22-year-old college graduate died. Ms. Worsham's testimony was gut-wrenching, but unfortunately, she is not alone. We've heard other stories just like hers from our constituents, our friends, and our loved ones. Today, we are examining the price of a drug called Truvada. Truvada is a phenomenal drug that prevents the transmission of HIV through a treatment called pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP for short. At the outset, I want to recognize the efforts of our distinguished colleague, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. She has been leading the charge on this issue, and it is because of her efforts that we are holding this hearing today. I want to thank her for her phenomenal leadership. Think about this. We now have a drug that has the potential to end the HIV epidemic. This would have been unfathomable at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis. This is an issue that I've been dealing with and working with communities on for more than 20-some years. I've seen many people die. I've seen people who used to be on the choir in my church die. I've seen neighbors die. And we have made these phenomenal strides. But this treatment was developed as a result of investments made by the American taxpayers through the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The problem is that Gilead, the company that now sells this drug, charges astronomical prices. When Truvada was first approved in 2004, Gilead charged about $800 per month, again, for this life-saving drug. Since then, Gilead raised the price of this drug over and over and over and over and over again. It now charges about $2,000 for just 1 month, or about $70 per pill. Think about that. Life-saving drug. In the same period, Gilead has made massive windfalls on this treatment, more than $36 billion in revenues. Let me say that one more time. They made more than $36 billion on this drug alone. How can Gilead do this? How can our system allow a company to take a drug treatment that was developed with taxpayer funds and abuse its monopoly to charge such astronomical prices? This life-saving treatment would not exist but for the research funded by the CDC and NIH. So how can our system let a company charge prices that are so outrageous, making $36 billion, while there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who need this drug. We're better than that. These are some of the hard questions we will ask Gilead CEO Daniel O'Day, who is here today. And I'm praying that you do not come and give us the normal rope-a-dope stuff that we usually hear about the various little programs you got, the coupons you got. We want the prices to come down. We want truth. We want to know why it is that the prices are going up astronomically. We want to know what this R&D is all about. We want to know if it's all about vacation, giving doctors vacations and encouraging them to prescribe certain things or not. We need to know all about that. We appreciate that Mr. O'Day accepted our invitation to participate, and we anxiously look forward to his testimony. The reason this is so critical is because the CDC estimates that there are 1.1 million people at high risk of contracting HIV who could benefit from this drug, but that only a fraction are getting it. Use is shockingly low among groups that are particularly high risk, including communities of color that have been disproportionately impacted by this epidemic. This treatment is available in other countries for much, much less. In Australia, patients pay less than $7 a pill. Hello. Here we're paying well over 70. In other countries, patients pay less, even less. This is because Gilead charges less for its treatment overseas than it does in the United States. It's also because Gilead has generic competitors there, but not here. Finally, let me note that this is a bipartisan issue. HIV has no boundaries. It affects blacks and whites, rural, urban. It is a tough disease. President Trump recently announced an initiative to end the HIV epidemic within 10 years. This is a laudable goal. However, it relies on this particular drug treatment getting to everyone who needs it. Gilead recently agreed to donate millions of bottles of this drug, but far short of what we need to save lives. Without addressing the fundamental problem of pricing, I'm afraid that we simply may not get there. So we want to work with the President in addressing HIV, but we need to start right here, and we need to start right now. So without further ado, I want to recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Jordan, for his comments.
Mr. Chairman, welcome back, and thank you for that and for this hearing, this important hearing. At the beginning of the HIV outbreak in the early 80s, the outlook was just not good. In fact, it was pretty darn bleak. Early treatments were expensive and frankly not very effective, but advancements in medicine in the 38 years since the first reported incidence of AIDS in the United States have yielded hope for those afflicted with this virus. The most important development was Gilead creating and bringing Truvada to market in 2004. Because of the invention of this, life expectancy for people with HIV is now effectively the same as life expectancy for people without it. I think we can all agree that Truvada is something of a miracle drug. It's the gold standard for preventing and treating HIV. Gilead's invention has been literally life-saving. Gilead, of course, made money based on its invention. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle and some of the witnesses they have invited seem to believe this is some sort of conspiracy. Rather than applaud Gilead for manufacturing this miracle drug, they wish to demonize the company for making a profit. The right to reap the rewards of your invention is so vital that our framers included it in the Constitution. Our intellectual property protections are the crown jewel of the American economy and are what makes our nation the most innovative in human history. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, the Congress shall have power, quote, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing, for limited times, to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. The framers knew that individuals would take risk and endeavor to make great things if they knew they would be rewarded. Some would have you believe that Gilead did not invent this drug or discover its uses, and that the federal government has equities here for which the company is not accounting. The evidence does not bear this out, and I hope we can use today to set the record straight. I fear that my colleagues are using today's hearing as a platform to strong-arm private companies making breakthrough discoveries, all because they are upset at how markets work. The reality is that while Gilead has made money on this drug, there do not seem to be genuine issues of access, and that is largely due, as the chairman talked about, to progress made by efforts of the Trump administration. The State of the Union address this year, President Trump announced his administration's initiative to eliminate new HIV infections in the U.S. within 10 years. This would be a remarkable breakthrough for public health. And to that end, just last week, HHS announced that as a result of discussions between the Trump administration and Gilead, the company agreed to donate 2.4 million vials of its PrEP medication annually to the CDC for distribution to treat individuals who are at risk and uninsured. The company has also agreed, though it was under no obligation to do so, to allow generics to enter the market a year earlier to further help provide access. Of course, the cost of pharmaceuticals is a problem, driven by many factors that our committee and the Trump administration hope to tackle in a bipartisan fashion, as the chairman indicated. But we will never make real advancements in public health if the plan is to use false pretenses to attack and vilify those that are making game-changing scientific breakthroughs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the discussion from all our witnesses this morning, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now want to welcome our witnesses. Dr. Robert Grant, Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Grant led one of the clinical trials demonstrating that Truvada could be used to prevent the transmission of HIV. Dr. Rochelle Walensky, the Chief of Infectious Diseases at Massachusetts General Hospital and Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, who was an expert on cost effectiveness in HIV treatment. Mr. Tim Horn, the Director of Medication Access for the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors, who has also worked in HIV treatment advocacy. Stefan Ezel from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Mr. Aaron Lord, a PrEP user and co-founder of PrEP for All. Dr. Lord's personal experience led him to advocate on behalf of others, and we are glad to have him with us today. And finally, Mr. Daniel O'Day, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Gilead Sciences, Inc. Now, if you all could please rise and raise your right hands, and I will now swear in the witnesses. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. The microphones are quite sensitive, so please speak directly into them. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Mr. Grant, you are now recognized to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Please note that I would ask that you stay within, all of you, stay within the 5-minute limit. And before you get started, Ms. Castillo-Cortez, I mentioned before you got here that you were a main driver in making sure that this hearing happened today, and I want to thank you for your leadership. All right, Dr. Grant.
Chairman Cummings,
Good morning.
Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, I'm pleased to testify today on how the promise of PrEP remains unfulfilled. I devoted the last 20 years of my career to the development of PrEP. I am here today at my own expense because I promised that PrEP would become available if proven. We have not kept that promise. I come today to ask for your help. My PrEP research was funded by grants from the NIH starting in 2002. I later received supplemental funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Other research was funded by NIH, CDC, and Gates. The U.S. government provided the majority of funds for PrEP research, investing hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. Furthermore, CDC scientists discovered that adding a drug called FTC to tenofovir increased protection, and it's the combination of those two medications which is FDA approved today. The CDC scientists also demonstrated that pre-exposure dosing added substantially to the protective event, and it's these inventions that led to CDC government patents that were awarded several years ago. Gilead did not provide leadership, innovation, or funding for PrEP research. Gilead's role was limited to donating study drug and placebos. In my experience, Gilead proved to be a hesitant partner in PrEP research. For example, Gilead made public in 2005 that it would not seek FDA approval for PrEP, no matter what the data showed. Although not supporting the research with funding or innovation, Gilead took steps to limit research on alternative and competing PrEP agents. In particular, there was interest in 3TC, a competing drug, because it was about to go off patent. Interest in 3TC PrEP dissipated with assurances that Gilead's Truvada would be generically available by the time efficacy trials were completed. 8 years after the completion of U.S. government-funded efficacy trials, generic Truvada is still not available in the United States. PrEP scale-up has failed. PrEP demand in the U.S. hit a tipping point in 2013 and then plateaued in 2016. Currently, only 1 in 10 people who could benefit from PrEP are receiving it. What little access has occurred is not fairly distributed. For example, Black people suffer 44% of new HIV infections, while only 10% of PrEP users are Black. Gilead has had 7 years to get PrEP marketing right. It's time we try something else. Our struggle against HIV is stuck. HIV is not stuck. HIV infects nearly 40,000 Americans every year, and there's been no decline since 2016. In my experience, the root cause of low PrEP access is the high price. Other barriers to PrEP access arise as consequences of the exorbitant drug prices. These factors may include fragmented insurance coverage, lack of awareness by providers and potential users, and stigma. At a competitive price, people would feel at ease to provide and use PrEP. PrEP can be manufactured and distributed for $6 per person per month. $6 per person per month in manufacturing and distribution costs. Gilead charges more than $2,100 per person per month, a 35,000% markup. Gilead's prices continue to increase every single year. The price of Truvada increased 76% since I published evidence of PrEP efficacy in 2010 using U.S. government funding. You might hear that no one pays list price. This is not true. The University of California Student Health Services pays full price for PrEP, and it is their largest drug expense. All populations have multiple competing needs related to heart health, cancer prevention, mental health, substance use, reproductive health, and so much more. Should any public health jurisdiction pay a 35,000% markup for a drug that addresses only one of these concerns? Hard choices have to be made in public health, and they are made. However, PrEP becomes an easy choice if it is available at a competitive market price. For example, 3 states in Australia purchased generic PrEP for $8 per person per month after a competitive process. What followed was the largest and fastest PrEP scale-up the world has ever seen. I believe that there are actions that you could take, that this committee could take at this time, that would make PrEP available. PrEP continues to be underutilized, despite 7 years of drug donations, community grants, and assistance programs. A market price would change the game. I ask you to consider 3 actions. This committee could insist that taxpayers benefit from U.S. government intellectual property. Second, you could scrutinize agreements between originator and generic manufacturers for anti-competitive practices, such as pay for delay. I believe that these actions would take PrEP off the shelf and stop HIV at a price that we all can afford. Thank you.
Dr. Malinsky.
Good morning, Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee. My name is Dr. Rochelle Walensky. I'm a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Massachusetts General Hospital, a practicing clinician, and a researcher on the cost-effectiveness of HIV care both in the U.S. and internationally. In 1995, we told patients with AIDS they would, with certainty, die. AIDS plagued my internship. By the end of that year, we had an FDA-approved HIV cocktail, 3 drugs, up to 14 pills a day, which, if taken without fail, allowed AIDS patients to live. At the time, the 3 drugs of the cocktail cost a total of $15,000 per person per year, and our research team reported its cost effectiveness. We demonstrated it was good value for money. Today, we definitively have the tools to end this epidemic. The HIV 3-drug cocktail, termed antiretroviral therapy, is frequently co-formulated into a single daily pill. The regimens have high resistance barriers, that's good. They have low toxicity profiles, that's also good. And projections suggest a normal life expectancy for adherent patients with HIV. We also know that people who take these drugs and effectively suppress their virus cannot transmit it to anyone else. But the cost of these drug regimens today is $40,000 to $50,000 per person per year, a 300% increase in 25 years. Truvada is a co-formulation of 2 of these 3 drugs used for treatment, scientifically known as the combination of tenofovir disoproxil fumarate and emtricitabine. It was FDA approved for HIV treatment in August 2004 and has since then been a mainstay of HIV care. In 2012, following remarkable scientific work, much of which was led by Dr. Grant, the FDA approved the expanded indication of Truvada for pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, for HIV prevention. The cost of Truvada, when FDA approved in 2004, was $7,800 per year. Today, it costs $20,000 per year. A similar drug combination is available internationally at a cost of $60 per year. Please understand, I'm not proposing that this is what the price should be in the United States. I simply provide that benchmark for our national pricing to put it into global context. In his February State of the Union address, the President announced his initiative to end the HIV epidemic. This will not be easy. The benchmarks for the End the Epidemic initiative are a decrease in the number of new HIV infections by 75% in 5 years and by 90% by 2030. Our research group has published work highlighting that even if we get 90% of people with HIV diagnosed, treated, and virologically suppressed, we can only decrease the number of new infections by 40%. In short, to end this epidemic, we need both treatment and prevention. Aside from treatment, PrEP offers the most efficacious prevention intervention known. Make no mistake, even if it was free, PrEP is difficult. In addition to drug adherence, it requires quarterly doctor visits for HIV testing, sexually transmitted infection screening, and laboratory monitoring. But right now, the biggest problem with PrEP is access. The CDC estimates that more than 1.1 million people in the United States are at high enough HIV risk to warrant PrEP. Fewer than 150,000 have ever received it. Over 75% of those are white gay men in the Northeast and the West Coast. But today's uncontrolled HIV epidemic is rampant among Black gay men and continues to disproportionately affect women of color, especially in the South. In 2016, it was estimated that 1 in 2 Black gay men would be diagnosed with HIV in their lifetime. We need prevention tools like PrEP to reach these marginalized populations if we are ever even going to make a dent in this epidemic, never mind to reach the auspicious end the epidemic goals. The sale of Truvada has resulted in profits of $36 billion, and Truvada, unchanged, has seen a price increase of 150% since 2004. That price tag is simply too high. We have the scientific tools to end this HIV epidemic, and we are fortunate that pharma has developed these drugs to get us there. They have already profited enormously. Now, in the spirit of saving lives, of preventing new infections, of realizing a public health, putting forth a cohesive public health response, and realizing a presidential call to action, I simply ask that these drugs be reasonably priced so that those most marginalized and at risk can reap their benefit. And finally, I would like to applaud Congress for holding this hearing and bringing this issue to the forefront in the public dialogue. I hope that some of these companies, including Gilead, will begin to do the right thing. It's never too late for that. Thank you.
Mr. Warren.
Thank you, and good morning. Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee, my name is Tim Horn, and I am Director of Medication Access and Pricing at NASDAD, which is the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors. I am very pleased to be here today to offer testimony on PrEP access and pricing in the United States. NASDAD is a nonpartisan, nonprofit association that represents public health officials who administer HIV and hepatitis programs in the U.S. and around the world. We represent public health officials in all 50 U.S. states, the District of Columbia, the U.S. territories, and several local jurisdictions. I'd like to focus my comments today on the intersection of the high cost of Truvada as PrEP and the need for effective, comprehensive, affordable, and importantly, sustainable public health approaches to HIV prevention in the United States. Now, our ability to respond to the needs of people who have been diagnosed with HIV is one of the greatest examples of effective public health in the United States. The Ryan White HIV/AIDS program ensures access to not only comprehensive state-of-the-art care, but importantly, low or no-cost treatment made possible with significant discounting provided to aid drug assistance programs, or ADAPs. ADAPs ensure treatment for nearly a quarter of all people living with HIV in the United States, the vast majority of whom are living at, below, or near the federal poverty level. Now, one thing I want to emphasize here is that there is no such comprehensive federal medication program for people at risk for HIV. And I just want to be clear, the only difference between someone living with HIV and someone at risk for HIV is a diagnosis. Those vulnerable to HIV infection face the exact same barriers to affordable medication in the United States. We are failing populations at high risk for HIV infection, including young Black and Latino gay men, women, and transgender individuals. We are failing them because we have not built the payment and culturally appropriate delivery systems that are best able to reach them. There are many reasons for the low uptake of PrEP in this country, but financing and pricing, the subject of today's hearing, are undoubtedly among them. In order to end the HIV epidemic, we must build systems that provide access to PrEP for all populations. Now, our current PrEP system, particularly for uninsured and underinsured people vulnerable to HIV infection, is essentially built on the back of Gilead's medication assistance program for those who are uninsured and meet strict financial eligibility criteria, along with the company's copay assistance program for individuals who are commercially insured. Now, while these programs have undoubtedly helped expand access to the medication component of comprehensive PrEP services, they have also succeeded in largely masking the impact of the high price of Truvada. To be clear, these programs are not a substitute for functioning public health and healthcare systems. Partnerships with pharmaceutical manufacturers will always be important, but outsized dependency on their generosity, which in turn is dependent on their bottom line, is by no means an equitable and sustainable solution. Now, the 340B drug pricing program has also played an important role in allowing public health programs and their community partners, including federally qualified health centers, to afford PrEP while extending federal resources as far as possible. But it doesn't go far enough. Even if we assume that the price available to 340B entities in the U.S. is 75% to 80% below the list price, this still translates into approximately $400 per month per person, a price that is at least 4 times higher than what we can reasonably expect with robust generic competition. Additionally, 340B pricing of Truvada as PrEP is only available to some health departments and family planning clinics, and is not available to other institutions where PrEP may be of significant benefit. Gilead's assistance programs, the 340B program discounting, and the recent announcement of donated PrEP will continue to help expand access to PrEP. However, a long-term sustainable approach to PrEP access requires a competitive generic market. To this end, we believe federal, state, and community partners should be cautious not only not to allow the present and future of existing patchwork measures to build an artificial market for Gilead's Descovy, which is expected to be approved for PrEP by the end of this year. Doing so will undercut the ability of the generic market for generic versions of Truvada to bring down cost for our public payers, our commercial payers, and most importantly, people vulnerable to HIV infection. Importantly, a lower-cost form of PrEP would allow for more affordable procurement and expanded access across a variety of settings, including state and local health departments, family planning clinics, and STD clinics. And I want to underscore Dr. Grant's point. The list price of Truvada is the price that some of our most important programs do in fact pay. Not only has the high cost of Truvada been a barrier in scaling up affordable access to PrEP by these programs, they have required some programs to reallocate funding from other public health initiatives to meet HIV prevention priorities. So I do want to conclude by thanking the committee for the opportunity to testify today and for initiating a dialogue that hopefully will be to the betterment of people vulnerable to HIV infection and other intersecting conditions. Thank you.
Mr. Ezell.
Good morning, Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee. I'm Stephen Ezell, Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, Washington, D.C.-based science, technology, and economic policy think tank, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify in the panel this morning about the U.S. life sciences innovation system. The United States clearly leads the world in life sciences innovation. For instance, in the 2000s, U.S. headquartered enterprises generated more new-to-the-world drugs than enterprises from the next 5 nations combined. And over the past 2 decades, U.S. companies have accounted for almost half of the world's new drugs, including treatments such as for leukemia, skin cancer, inherited blindness, and a set of treatments for HIV/AIDS that have made a disease that was once a death sentence now treatable, and hopefully will have a full cure in years to come. However, it was not always that way. In fact, in the 1970s, the United States was a global also-ran in life sciences innovation, as European headquartered companies invented twice as many new-to-the-world drugs as ours did in the 1970s. What's changed over the past 4 decades has been a concerted and intentional set of policy choices designed to make America the world's leader in life sciences innovation. Those policies are anchored in 3 key tenets. First, robust and complementary public and private investment in life sciences R&D, effective mechanisms to facilitate the transfer of technology from universities and federal laboratories to the private sector for commercialization, underpinned by strong intellectual property rights, such as embodied in the Bayh-Dole Agreement, and a drug pricing system that allows companies to earn revenues that can be reinvested into future generations of biomedical innovation. The U.S. invests by far more than any other nation in life sciences R&D. In fact, analysts estimate that the United States has invested 70 to 80% of global biomedical R&D investment over the past 2 decades. It's anchored by federal government investment of about $39 billion a year into basic life sciences research that focuses on understanding fundamental processes by which diseases develop and transmitted, or identifying novel biomarkers indicating the presence of disease. This basic research creates a platform for innovation, potentially leading to the discovery of new medicines, tests, or procedures. The private sector complements this public sector investment with, in some years, close to $95 billion in annual R&D, focused on the applied research and clinical trials necessary to bring safe and effective breakthrough drugs to market. The fact is, this drug development process is lengthy, risky, and expensive. Studies vary, and I'm happy to share results of several with the committee, but research finds that on average, developing a new pharmaceutical compound takes an average of 11.5 to 15 years at a cost of $1.7 to $3.2 billion. It's absolutely vital to recognize that public and private investments are complementary. A recent Journal of Nature article estimates that on average, biotechnology companies invest $100 in development for every $1 the government invests in research leading to a specific innovative drug. If you take the case of the breakthrough anti-cancer prostate cancer drug, Xtandi, developed primarily by Astellas and its partners, it's estimated that about $2 million in federally funded research conducted at UCLA was complemented by over $900 million of private sector investment required to bring Xtandi to market. That's a nice example of the almost 300 new drugs, vaccines, and devices that have been developed as a result of public-private partnerships facilitated in part by the Bayh-Dole Act since its enactment in 1980. Just like semiconductors, movies, or music, life sciences is an innovation-based industry, meaning that companies incur extremely high upfront fixed costs of initial design and development that must be recouped, amidst failure rates that approach 95%. Moreover, these companies fundamentally depend upon the profits earned from one generation of innovation to finance investment in the next. Hopefully, Gilead's investment in HIV/AIDS drugs will generate profits that enable its ongoing efforts in areas like hemophilia and oncology to generate breakthrough treatments tomorrow. This dynamic is why America's life sciences sector is the world's most R&D intensive, investing 44% of its value added into subsequent R&D. The reality is that there is a direct link between pharmaceutical company revenues and their ability to reinvest in future generations of innovation. They are intimately and causally linked. In conclusion, a key reason why the U.S. life sciences innovation system has been so successful is that we've created a framework for effective public-private partnerships where each party contributes what it does best. Public research generating a stock of knowledge that can be innovated upon by the private sector, investing the hundreds of millions required to bring an innovative new drug to the market. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lloyd.
Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee, I thank you for inviting me here today to testify. My name is Aaron Lord. I am here today as a physician, as an HIV activist, and a co-founder of the Prep for All collaboration, as well as a proud gay man. I was born and raised in West Virginia. I attended Georgetown University on federal scholarship. I then attended medical school at Columbia, and I'm currently an assistant professor at NYU, but I am not here in my official capacity. Since realizing I was a gay man in my early teens, like so many in my community, I lived in fear of acquiring HIV. The reality hit all too close to home when early on in our relationship, my future husband, who I cherished and loved dearly, was diagnosed with HIV. In July 2012, the FDA announced the approval of Truvada as PrEP. It's the first drug approved to prevent rather than treat HIV. It is highly effective, reducing risk by over 99% when taken as prescribed. Since 2012, I have taken Truvada every day to protect my health and the health of my community. With this medication, I no longer have to live in fear. Despite PrEP's remarkable efficacy, the number of new HIV infections in the US remains the same today as when PrEP was approved in 2012, with one person becoming newly diagnosed every 15 minutes. We know it doesn't have to be this way. We know that when PrEP is made universally accessible at no cost, new HIV infections dramatically decrease. In Sydney, Australia, new HIV infections decreased by 25% statewide in 1 year when public health officials used low or no-cost PrEP to reach all those at risk. In the US, however, we are failing to reach those most vulnerable, with mere fractions of at-risk women and Black and Latino men getting PrEP, and rates in use in the South remain stubbornly low. Too many of us are still living in fear. A root cause of this problem is the price. Gilead Sciences, who makes the only PrEP available in this country, charges us over $2,000 a month, or over 400 times what FDA-approved generics cost internationally. And while Mr. O'Day will certainly state that his company has earned the right to charge such exorbitant sums, Truvada as PrEP is not Gilead's invention. Truvada as PrEP is an invention of the US government,
whose research and development was funded exclusively by U.S. taxpayers and the Gates Foundation, and is protected by multiple robust patents issued to the CDC. Even the very patents that Mr. O'Day currently uses to prevent the American people from accessing generic Truvada are themselves based on research funded by the U.S. taxpayer. Price is not the only barrier preventing people from using PrEP. Stigma, racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, poverty, they all play a role. These barriers can and must be mitigated. But we cannot do it if our healthcare system spends over $20,000 a year on Mr. O'Day's drug instead of spending it on precious programming to fight these barriers. Mr. O'Day, we are suffocating under the weight of your company's pricing. Mr. O'Day, for a figure far less than $2.6 billion, which is what we spend on your egregiously overpriced medication every year, we could have a national, far-reaching PrEP program that guarantees every person who needs PrEP can get it, including free medicine, clinical care, lab testing, and transportation. And we could still have $500 million left over for community organizations to fight these barriers. Mr. O'Day, you have given the American people a very bad deal for our money. We have learned all too well from Gilead's past misdeeds what happens when they are left to their own devices. As the White and Grassley report so vividly showed, Gilead's pricing of their cure for hepatitis C at $1,000 a pill was aimed to do one thing: maximize their profit. The consequences of that unmitigated greed resulted in a public health disaster. Despite spending $50 billion of our hard-earned dollars buying overpriced medication, the number of new hepatitis C infections more than tripled. I'm here today to say that HIV activists will not stand by and allow this to happen ever again. So, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, I ask you as a representative of my community, as a proud American, as a scientist, and as a patient, to join me in asking, Mr. O'Day, what justification do you have for charging $2,000 a month for Truvada as PrEP when the American people funded the innovation of the molecule, invented its use as PrEP, and funded 4 clinical trials to prove its efficacy? Mr. O'Day, we do not ask for your company's charity or for tax-deductible donations that meet your company's needs, but fail to meet the needs of our communities. Rather, we ask, Mr. O'Day, why not lower the price of Truvada to $15 a month right here, today, at this hearing? Members of Congress, the American people have invented a way to end the HIV epidemic, and that we should be very proud of. And we look to you today to ensure that every single person in this country can protect themselves from this plague. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. O'Day.
Good morning, Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee. My name is Daniel O'Day. I recently joined Gilead as its new Chief Executive Officer. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Gilead is an American biotech company that for the past 3 decades has been focused on creating therapies that prevent, treat, and cure some of the world's worst diseases. To name just a few examples, Gilead invented the first once-daily pill to cure hepatitis C, Tamiflu for influenza, and the first and currently only FDA-approved HIV prevention medication, Truvada, along with 10 other drugs used in the treatment of HIV. When I decided to become CEO, I had long admired Gilead's remarkable contribution to healthcare and the high level of innovation behind their medicines. Importantly, I knew I was joining a company that was committed to the interest of patients and dedicated to pursuing scientific excellence to prevent and cure diseases. All of this is evident in Gilead's approach to HIV, the commitment to developing HIV medications that are safer, more patient-friendly, and more effective. Gilead researchers have made contributions that fundamentally changed the course of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, transforming the disease from a death sentence to a manageable chronic condition. Gilead was founded in the midst of the AIDS crisis. At that time, people living with HIV were required to take a cocktail of 20-plus pills each day to treat the disease. Many of these drugs led to serious, often debilitating side effects. And even when taken as directed, the therapies offered an average life expectancy of less than 40 years of age, with most people dying within just a few years of contracting the disease. In the early 1990s, Gilead began working to invent a single-pill HIV treatment. Following nearly a decade of work and about $6 billion invested in research, $1.1 billion of which was devoted specifically to Truvada, Gilead launched Truvada as one of the first fixed-dose combination pills for HIV treatment in 2004. Today, Truvada and other Gilead medicines have contributed to nearly doubling the average life expectancy of people with the disease. Although Truvada was initially approved to treat HIV, researchers and public health officials knew for years that antiretroviral drugs like Truvada could also be used to prevent HIV infection, a technique referred to as PrEP. With this in mind, Gilead supported clinical trials that ultimately led to the approval of Truvada, the first and currently only medication approved for PrEP. To be clear, despite some media suggestions otherwise, Gilead invented Truvada, no one else. Gilead developed the two drugs that are combined in Truvada, invented the combination that allowed these drugs to be taken as a single pill, and invented the drugs used to treat HIV in combination with other antiviral drugs. I want to address the use patents on PrEP granted to the CDC. Using Truvada for PrEP was well known in the scientific community long before CDC claimed it as an invention. We believe the CDC patents are invalid, but we've chosen not to challenge those patents because we value our collaborative relationship with the agency. Finally, I want to address access to Truvada. Gilead is committed to ensuring that every American who needs Truvada can obtain it. We offer a wide range of programs to help ensure that people have access to Truvada when they need it. For example, 98% of people who use our copay assistance program have no out-of-pocket costs. In fact, according to the CDC's own estimates, when taking our programs into account, less than 1% of Americans who would benefit from PrEP are in need of a financial assistance to obtain Truvada. Moreover, we continue to work with advocates, providers, and governments to remove the societal and other barriers to broader PrEP usage. Last week, we took another important step for expanding access by donating Truvada for up to 200,000 uninsured Americans each year. We are committed to ending the HIV epidemic. We will work with Congress and others to further expand access to PrEP, and we will continue our scientific research in pursuit of a cure. In representing Gilead, I can assure you that we take our responsibility in HIV extremely seriously and will ensure you that this is always evident in our actions. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony today, and I'd be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Garcia-Cortez. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for agreeing to hold this hearing. And while I appreciate your generosity in acknowledging the role our office played in this hearing, I also have to give credit to the countless advocates and activists that have been uplifting the issue of the price of Truvada and PrEP. And I have to say that it's not because of me we're having this hearing, even in our office. It's because of a 23-year-old staffer, Miss Claudia Pagon Marchena, who first dug into, who first noticed this and first listened to the actual activists that raised this issue. She took the opportunity to pursue it, and if it wasn't for the openness and willingness of your leadership and committee staff to take her concerns seriously, we wouldn't be here today. And so I just think it's an incredible testimony to, despite the powerlessness we often feel in this political moment, it shows that everyday people, no matter your age or your identity, can make changes. And that's the reason why we are having this hearing today, so thank you. I'd also, before I begin, would like to submit to the congressional record New York City Council Speaker Corey Johnson, who himself is HIV positive, his testimony to the congressional record. So I seek unanimous consent to do so.
Without objection to order.
Thank you so much. So let's get down to the core of this hearing. Truvada, Dr. Grant, Truvada for PrEP is the only known drug that can prevent the transmission of HIV, correct?
It's the only medication that's been approved by the FDA. It's also known that tenofovir alone is prophylactic for HIV.
Thank you. And Dr. Grant, it was your NIH-funded research on PrEP that built on the earlier research work patented by CDC researchers. Is that correct?
Yes, my clinical trial was informed by CDC research in two ways. One, the CDC demonstrated that the pre-exposure dose was added to the efficacy of the of PrEP.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. And I would also like to seek unanimous consent to submit this Yale School of Law study into the congressional record, which concludes that the CDC's patents for PrEP were both valid and enforceable against Gilead.
Ordered.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lord, thank you for your advocacy here today. Is it true that the public invested $50 million to develop PrEP?
That is correct.
Is it also true that Gilead relied on publicly funded trials to obtain FDA approval?
Yes, if you look at their supplementary new drug application, you'll see that every sponsor of Truvada S PrEP was a non-Gilead sponsor.
So the public invested to develop the drug. The public invested and funded the trials for FDA approval. Is it true that the pharmaceutical companies forced the public to pay twice, first when investing in drug discovery, but then it looks like these patient assistance programs that they tout very often also have a public investment piece as well, right? How are these public assistance programs funded?
Yeah, so I think as far as like the copay assistance program goes, it's important to also note that it only exists in its current state due to the work of activists. We have worked for years to get them to increase from initially a $300 a month copay assistance, which left people with hundreds, if not $1,000 of copay per month. And then they really only increased it to $4,800 after additional years of activist pressure, and that still left thousands of dollars of donut hole potential for some patients. And then it only took a New York Times op-ed that we published, to threaten March-in rights on this drug in order to get them to raise it to the $7,200, which is still not enough.
Thank you. And even when it comes to when folks can't access PrEP because it's so expensive and we spread, the HIV epidemic continues, that also comes at a public cost, right? So the public is paying, we paid to develop PrEP, we paid to finance the publicly funded trials to develop this drug. We also pay and foot the bill with patient assistance programs. Also, as you noted, the existence of these programs happened because of the public. And also we pay when the HIV epidemic gets spread as well. Very quickly, Mr. O'Day, you're the CEO of Gilead. Is it true that Gilead made $3 billion in profits from the sales of Truvada in 2018?
$3 billion in revenue.
Oh, yes, in revenue, thank you. And very quickly, the current list price is $2,000 a month in the United States, correct?
The current list price is $1,780 in the United States, and just to correct, the $3 billion was a global figure.
Okay,
for Truvada for PrEP in 2000.
So the list price is almost $2,000 in the United States. Why is it $8 in Australia?
Truvada still has patent protection in the United States, and in the rest of the world it is generic. I can't comment on the price in Australia of the generic medicines, but it is generically available in other parts of the world and will be generically available in the United States as of September in 2020, based upon Gilead agreeing to support generic entries 1 year
So
early.
I think it's important that we notice here that we, the public, we, the people, developed this drug, we paid for this drug, we led and developed all of the grounding patents to create PrEP, and then that patent has been privatized, despite the fact that the patent is owned by the public. We refuse to enforce it. There's no reason this should be $2,000 a month. People are dying because of it, and there's no enforceable reason for it. We own the core intellectual property for it, and as a result, people are dying for no reason, to develop this drug. Thank you very much.
Time has expired. Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree. I believe that prescription drug pricing, it's a conversation that I get. It's one of the biggest ones we get in our constituency or in our office, both in D.C. and back in our offices in North Dakota. And it should be a bipartisan endeavor. And in fact, we've had a package of prescription drug bills that have come through 2 committees here, and I know in at least one they passed unanimously. But unfortunately, we're in DC and never allowing a political opportunity to go to waste. They're going to get marked up in Rules Committee, and we're going to vote on bills this week that just quite frankly have no chance of becoming law. So when we talk about bipartisanship, we have two sets of packages that could come to the floor clean this week that would pass. They'd pass the Senate. The president could sign them by the end of the month, but that's not going to happen. So, Mr. O'Day, it's been said that NIH spent $51 million on clinical trials for PrEP. Is that correct?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, it's important to point out that Gilead has spent $1.1 billion developing this medicine. Gilead has the patents on this medicine. And in the course of the PrEP indication, it's also important to take us back to that period of time of history with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. It was a time when prevention of AIDS was actually something that was highly controversial, both from a scientific standpoint, resistance, but also from public advocacy, because there were questions around the morality of providing a preventive medicine that could take away from safe sex practices and others. So this was a public health question that needed to be answered, and we partnered with several members of the community. It's a very complex topic. For the PrEP indications, we supported it with medicines. We have two of our Gilead scientists that are co-authors on one of the fundamental trials, the IPREX trial, that Dr. Grant has spoken to before, and to be an author on these trials in a highly regarded third-party publication, you need to have sufficient involvement in those trials. So Gilead had sufficient involvement in those trials. The NIH provided $50 million in grant. The Gates Foundation supplied $17 million in grants. And the Gates Foundation also independently funded the second trial that was used for this indication with $70 million as well. So it was a partnership amongst public and private institutions to get this indication.
And you said in your opening statement you provide financial assistance to uninsured patients. How does that work?
So we have two basic programs to help with patients. One is the copay assistance program. So patients that have commercial insurance, that have a high deductible cost for their medicines, we have a program that supports them. In fact, patients that access our copay programs during the life of the patent that we have of the product, 98% of people take nothing out of their pocket when they go to the pharmacy, zero. The other end of the spectrum, we have deep discounts to government programs that allow patients in Medicaid, Medicare, ADAP programs to access our medicines at 70 to 80% discounts for the list prices that we've discussed here today. Finally, for the uninsured patient population that is truly not met by these needs, we've been working with CDC and announced one of the largest ever donations of medicine last week in conjunction with HHS and CDC. By the CDC's own estimates, they've estimated that of the 1.1 million patients that are susceptible to HIV, 200,000 are uninsured. We have donated, as a result of the announcement last week, for all 200,000 of those patients to receive free Truvada for the next 10 years.
And I grew up in the early 80s, and so, I mean, this was, and we've come a long way since then, and we have a long way to go. But, I mean, particularly when we're talking about the uninsured population as it relates to HIV and access to drugs, I mean, it's a debilitating, crippling disease. We're working towards prevention, we're working towards cure, but those factors to that uninsured population aren't unique to this healthcare crisis, are they?
Well, yeah, this is quite a unique circumstance, and because of the fact that at the end of the day, there are so many things that are getting in the way of people that require PrEP getting PrEP. There's access to the healthcare system for sure, but there's also education for physicians, education for patients, and there's a tremendous amount of stigma associated with this disease, which comes into play for the underserved communities. And this is something that Gilead has been focused on, provided hundreds of millions of dollars in supporting community associations to try to get at these other root causes of PrEP. And it's absolutely what's required to help eliminate the disease. I completely agree that we have to attack it from both a prevention as well as a treatment standpoint to eliminate this disease, and we're a big part of that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I recognize myself now. Mr. O'Day, other drug companies sat in the very seat, that very seat that you're sitting in, like Martin Shkreli, and all offer the same excuses and justifications. Same thing. They claim they have patient assistance programs to help those who cannot access the drug. But the truth is that somebody, is paying for these exorbitant prices. And that impacts everybody in the system. That is one reason health care now is so expensive. At the end of the day, it is the taxpayers who bear the cost of these skyrocketing prices through government programs like Medicaid. Dr. Lloyd, isn't it true that in some countries, the generic version of this treatment is sold for a fraction of the U.S. price? Is that right?
That is correct.
And how much is it sold for overseas?
According to the Global Fund, you can purchase this medication for under $5 a month.
That's astonishing. Yet Gilead is charging around close to $1,800 a month.
Yeah.
Mr. O'Day, in your written statement, you claim that your company spent $1.1 billion on research and development related to Truvada. But you made $36 billion in revenue on Truvada since it was approved in 2004. That's according to your own company's SEC filings. Mr. O'Day, do you believe that that is appropriate, and do you believe it's moral? You know, somebody said over here, I guess it's a thing of choices. One of my first employees died from AIDS. And I will never forget it, and I described it as dying on installment. It's a mother. It's rough to watch somebody die from AIDS. But anyway, you can answer my question.
Mr. Chairman, and I'm very sorry to hear about your
Employee.
employee.
It was a person,
Yes.
African-American young male, about 25 years old, dead.
I'm very sorry to hear that. The answer to the question is that we have spent more than $6 billion over the past, since 2020, on HIV research in general. And in fact, we've taken the disease from a death sentence to a manageable chronic condition with one pill once a day. But we're not done yet. We still have medicines, because of the fact that we now have the average life expectancy out to 78 years from 40 years, we never anticipated that people would be taking these medicines for decades. And some of the current generations of medicines have kidney and bone effects that now our next generations that we're launching will be able to have less of those effects and allow people to live longer, healthier lives. And yet we're not done, because we have to get to a stance where people aren't taking a daily pill, where they're taking it once a month, once every 2 months, or we hope we can get to a cure where people could take a limited course of therapy like in HCV, 12 weeks, and never have to worry about medicines again. In order to do that, we have to continue to invest in research for the patent life of our medicines. And of course, when patent ends, generics come on like they are in other parts of the world. But during that patent period of time, we also have a responsibility to make sure that Americans get our medicines when they're priced at a level that allows us to reinvest in research. And that's where our access programs of copay assistance, the donation to the CDC, come in to allow us to make sure that price doesn't get in the way during this period of time of patent exclusivity.
Can you tell me quickly about the timing of the donation that you all are making of medication? I think you said 200,000?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So it's 2.4 million bottles a year, which equates to around the PrEP treatment for around 200,000 patients for up to 10 years. And this includes both our current generation product, Truvada, as well as our advancement, which may come to market as early as later this year, which allows that better safety profile, if you like, for patients.
And how did you all come up with this 200,000? That's what I was trying to get to.
Oh, that was a number that was requested and discussed with the CDC. They acknowledged that in the 48 hotspot communities, District of Columbia, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and 7 rural states, that would be where the number of patients that would not qualify for federal programs or be involved in commercial insurance. So that number came from the CDC, and we were happy to support them with that.
And so if they had come up with a higher number, it's quite possible you would have given more. Is that a reasonable assumption?
That's a reasonable assumption. Yes, we're trying to solve the gap that isn't currently covered by our current access programs.
Mm-hmm. Do you Mr. O'Day, something was said here earlier, and I want you to be real clear. I've said this to many of the witnesses in the pharmaceutical industry. I have no problem with you all making a profit. I want you to make a profit. I want you to make a profit because I have seen what research can do. I have relatives that went, say, for example, from a chronic condition with cancer, from a terminal condition to chronic. I've seen it in a few years. And I also serve with Dr. Gallo on the Human Virology Board in Maryland. So we've been dealing with this a long time. But at the same time, I'm talking about the people who cannot get it. You know, the one who who's getting ready to die and will not be able to attend his daughter's wedding, that one. Or the mother who won't be there to see her children grow up, that lady. And what I'm saying to you is that, I want to work, we all want to work with the industry, but it's kind of hard. You can imagine when we hear about the $36 billion or the $3 billion, and I know it's global, I got that, $3 billion, and then we go back to our districts, and we see people, and they see the cure. They know the cure is out there. They know there's something out there called Truvada. They don't know you. They don't know who'll make it. All they know that there's something that could save their life, and they're reaching, trying to get it. And then they hear about these figures, and they say, they just can't get there. They cannot reach it. And I don't know whether those kind of things are taken into consideration in their boardrooms. Are they?
Absolutely. I can assure you that if there is a patient out there that cannot access Truvada because of financial means, our programs are designed to capture them. Again, we have the copay assistance for people with insurance, people without insurance that make less than 5 times the poverty level are provided with medicine for free through our medication assistance program.
And who pays for that?
Gilead pays for that.
So that cuts into your profit, is that what you're saying?
It's important to us to make sure that every patient can have access to the medicines, and it's absolutely part of our responsibility.
All right, I now recognize Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Day, what's the difference between Truvada and PrEP?
Truvada is a medicine that's used for HIV treatment and for prevention. It was discovered many years ago.
I guess my question is it the exact same drug? It's just used at a different time and in a different way?
The PrEP is an indication. It's one of the indications that Truvada is approved for.
Right, but so the drug is Truvada. It's used, and when we say, because Dr. Lord talked about Truvada as PrEP, it's the same drug.
Yeah, it's the same drug. It's the same mechanism. It's the same dose. It's the same
just a different
frequency.
Different use, different timing.
What Truvada does is it reduces viral replication of HIV, and that can be effective for.
I just want to be clear for everyone, though, that I think there could be some confusion that Truvada and PrEP are somehow some different drug. It's the same drug.
Truvada is the drug, PrEP is one of the indications that the drug is used for.
Got it. Okay. And earlier, Dr. Grant said Gilead did not provide leadership or funding for PrEP in the studies at CDC. Is that true?
No, that's not true. I mean, we have 9 scientists that were involved in the IPREX trial itself. Was one of the 2 trials that went to the FDA to seek approval. And of those, we have 2 scientists, both are still with the company actually, that were authors on the primary New England Journal article that is the IPREX study. And to be an author on the New England Journal of Medicine, you must have involvement in the trial, in addition to the free medicine we provided and the know-how.
Mr. O'Day, Gilead developed Truvada.
Correct.
You guys did that all on your own. Gilead participated with CDC on Truvada as PrEP, right?
Correct.
And your drug has made a difference for millions of people all over the world, right?
That's correct.
How many folks do you think have been impacted? People, I would say people are alive today because of your drug. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. And the 10 other medicines that Gilead makes, absolutely millions of people living with AIDS and preventing AIDS.
And how long did it take to develop Truvada?
Truvada was a long story. It goes back to the early 1990s. Truvada is a combination of 2 different medicines. One is called, for the sake of simplicity, TDF, and the other one is FTC. So this goes back to the early 90s and then into the early 2000s when FTC was evaluated by our scientists. And it's the combination of these 2 medicines that led to the first approval for Truvada in 2004 after a good decade to 15 years of research and lots of failures, by the way. I mean, 97.
Over a decade of research and trials and all kinds of effort to develop this miracle drug that has saved millions of people all over the planet. My guess is that cost a few dollars. What did it cost you to develop the drug?
Well, in this case, it cost $1.1 billion.
So billions of dollars to develop this amazing drug.
Yes.
That saved all kinds of folks. And now what are you doing with those profits? I think you said you're trying to find a cure, right?
Absolutely. We're investing them back into research. Our scientists and the colleagues I'm so inspired by at Gilead, they will not rest. They will not rest. Good enough was never good enough for them when we had this generation of medicines that had these kidney and bone toxicities, and we're now launching medicines that are much more tolerable for patients today. But they're not stopping. So we're looking at long-acting medicines.
And just last week you said for folks who can't afford it, folks who don't have insurance, you're going to give it to them free.
Absolutely.
Okay. So just let me get this straight. Over a decade of research, over $1 billion into that research, you develop a drug that saved millions of people, now can be used as PrEP prior to, not just as something after the fact that when people have been diagnosed with HIV. The profits you've made from that, you're now working on developing a cure, and just last week you announced folks who can't get the access to the medication right now, you're going to give it to them free.
Yes, Congressman.
But you're a bad guy. You're a bad guy. That's what we hear from the other side. I think that's, Mr. Ezel, isn't that exactly how it's supposed to work under the Constitution? People come up with a great idea. They go to the Patent and Trade Office. They get a patent for it. They get that patent for a certain length of time to recoup the billions of dollars it costs to make the product or the idea or whatever they did. That's helped millions of people. That's been great for this is one of the things that makes America the greatest place ever. Isn't that supposed to be how it's supposed to work?
That's exactly right, Representative Jordan. And, it's interesting to hear the questions about, well, how much cheaper is this drug in other countries of the world? Well, part of the problem is that other countries of the world are not as effective at innovating drugs because they
didn't make it.
That's
These guys
exactly
made
right.
it.
We've put in place a system.
I forgot to add one thing. I forgot another thing. They're going to go off patent a year early. Isn't that right, Mr. O'Day?
Yes. Generics will enter 1 year early.
So 1 year earlier is going to go to a lower cost. They don't have to do that. But somehow they're the bad guy, right? I just failed to. I appreciate what you've done and the thousands of people that are being impacted as we speak, the millions of people whose lives have been impacted, the folks who are alive today because of the work you've done. And we're going to beat you up. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this hearing, and I yield back my time.
I appreciate you. Well, let me say something. Let me make this clear. Listen up. Nobody has come in here to beat you up. I want to make that clear. I applaud Gilead. But it's nothing like holding the hand of somebody who is dying from AIDS. I'm sorry. And all we are trying to do is represent our constituents and help them stay alive. When you're dead, you're dead. And when I think about the fact that Truvada for PrEP is only getting to 10% of the people that need it, what about the other 90%? What about their families? I'm not knocking you. I'm just trying to figure out how we can help you get to the people who are dying as we speak. As we speak. And we can holler and we can play all these games, but let me be clear. Let me be clear. I speak for the dead and the living. And we are simply trying to get, again, I don't know who he's talking about, but I applaud Gilead. I've been dealing with this issue for 20-some years. So I know about it. And I know the problems, and I know the pain. And I know about the death by installment. So I want to be clear. Who's next?
Well, can I respond, Mr. Chairman?
No.
You've had like 9 minutes, and you just went after
Ms. Maloney.
me.
Ms. Maloney.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, you have
Thank you,
time.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I deeply
Would
appreciate
the
your
gentlelady
passion.
yield? Would the gentlelady yield just for 1 second?
No, I will not.
I wasn't playing.
I appreciate the leadership and passion of the chairman of this committee, Mr. Cummings, and I want to thank the advocates who advocated for it and my colleague from New York
Look at
who
the title of
negotiated this hearing. And I want to ask a question about the 90% that the chairman talked about. The 90% of Americans that want to get access to this drug. And I want to ask Mr. Horn, because how they get access is through the local health care system in our cities and in our states that are dealing with people hands-on every day. But first I have to say that I find it a national scandal that we are paying in this country $70 a pill, while Australia pays $7 a pill. How fair is that? And Mr. O'Day, you say that's because Australia negotiated a lower price. Well, we in America are going to pass a law that allows our government to negotiate a better price going forward. And today, we have 2 bills on the floor that will strike at this problem. It will end the abusive practice of drug companies where they pay to delay the development of generic drugs. A terrible abusive practice keeping affordable drugs from our people. And the other will stop the practice where drug companies pay to block. They literally pay to block the development of life-saving drugs here in America, where it was pointed out it's the American taxpayer that puts the money in on the ground and starts the research that then moves forward. And then our people don't have access to it? So Mr. Horn, I want to ask you, how does this high cost of PrEP limit the ability of states and local health departments and clinics from scaling up and providing the drugs and support to the 90% of people who need it that the chairman mentioned?
Thank you, Representative Maloney. First, I just want to sort of piggyback on one of your points, and just something that's really important to recognize is when we consider where we have the highest number of new infections in the United States. If you overlap that map with another map of like where we have not expanded Medicaid, for example, we definitely see where there is a tremendous disparity. So when we're thinking about those jurisdictions in particular, it's like this is where we find a number of people who are vulnerable to HIV infection really do become increasingly dependent on this incredibly complex patchwork in order to access not just PrEP, but all of the services that are required to support PrEP. Lab testing, supportive services, counseling, engagement in care, care, access to a care provider, so on and so forth. So, and I also just do want to reference that just with respect to, that the cost certainly isn't our only issue. We do have issues of stigma, discrimination, so on and so forth. But when we do take a look at what's happening with health departments, I will just reiterate, for many of our health departments, and we do have a number of states that have actually implemented state PrEP drug assistance programs. The one thing I will point out about that is that these are state-funded programs. They are not federally funded programs. Therefore, they do not have access to 340B discounting. Therefore, they are reliant on leveraging this very complex system in order to guarantee access to PrEP and the various services that are required.
I want to say that I have the privilege of representing New York, which has been at the forefront in combating the AIDS epidemic. And according to the City of New York, we've been making some progress. New AIDS, HIV infections in the city decreased by 36% between 2013 and 2017. But by increasing access to PrEP and making it affordable, they believe that they can bring new infections to less than 700 cases a year. This would be a dramatic improvement. And I'm afraid that by basing our public health response largely on the generosity of a private company that says they're going to make it affordable, it should be affordable to everyone. It should be affordable to everyone. They shouldn't have to negotiate having access to this drug. It's just putting the whole program in quicksand. It's not there to serve the people. So I want to ask, what do we need to do to make this affordable to people in our public health system, in our cities, in our states, in our clinics, in our local areas? Mr.
Gentleman, each time it expires, you may answer the question.
Okay. We just need to be conscious of cost at all points. I mean, we just need to make sure that that we are able to procure both PrEP and the services that are required for PrEP at an equitable price, and that we are moving in that direction. We are moving toward generics, and we just need to keep an eye on that. That really is the great unifier in terms of ensuring access to everyone who requires pre-exposure prophylaxis.
Thank you for your service.
Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for your testimony. I would want to point out, since my colleague from New York talked about voting on bills today, candidly, those bills today are nothing more than a political statement. There are both Republicans and Democrats willing to...
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. You didn't offer the same courtesy to my friend from Ohio, so I will say this. I am dead serious on actually lowering prescription drug prices and making sure that availability is here. I'm willing and have worked with my Democrat colleagues for us to put bills on the floor that actually are not a product of bipartisanship. Is not going to solve this problem. And so it's critically important that we allow for the R&D that happens, that has groundbreaking drugs that come to market, that they continue, and that we make sure that availability for all Americans, and indeed globally, are there. But with that, I'm going to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The chairman talked about playing games. I'm not playing games. I just want to thank a company who's developed a drug that saved millions of people, and not beat them up for that fact. I mean, you can look at on one hand, you go after them, and then you say, oh, but we're not really going after them. Look at the title of the hearing, Billions in Corporate Profits After Millions in Tax. You're going after them right in the title of today's hearing. Dr. Grant, in his opening testimony, said that Gilead had nothing to do with it. I got an article, peer-reviewed article from New England. In fact, I'd ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, enter the record. Gilead scientists participated in this. I don't remember any member thanking them for what they've done.
I did.
Not till after I did, that's for darn sure. So look, we want, as my colleague, we want prescription drug price, we want all drug prices to come down. We want that to happen, so let's figure out a way to do it. But I don't know that you do it by going after a company who's developed an amazing drug that has helped so many people, and they're taking the profits from that now to working on a cure. I don't see where that helps us. So anyway. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank the gentleman. So, Mr. Etzel, let me come to you. Really, at this particular point, what we've got is one of the greatest R&D abilities in terms of pharmaceuticals on the globe. In fact, most of the world looks to the United States for those groundbreaking drugs. Is that correct?
That is correct. The U.S. clearly leads the world in both investment in life sciences R&D and in commercializing new-to-the-world drugs that come out of that R&D.
And why do we lead the world in that? Is it just that we have the greatest brain power, or why would we lead the world in being able to do that? Why does that come from here and not from some other country?
It's a combination of factors, as I tried to indicate. First, a really strong complementarity between private and public investment. A lot of cases of public-private partnerships bring innovative new drugs to market.
So it's our coordination between the pharmaceutical industry, NIH, other areas where we have this to come up and have groundbreaking pharmaceuticals that actually meet the needs of not just the United States, but certainly the world at large. Is that correct?
That's a large part of it. Also a wonderful STEM talent pipeline, some of the best scientists in the world, and a system broadly that enables innovators to undertake the risky process of investing hundreds of millions, if not billions, into a possible new drug and earn for a temporary period of time revenues from those innovations that can then be reinvested into future generations.
So strong patents that actually help the proprietary investment that many companies make. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So if we look at that, one of the number one complaints I get, though, is with the rise of prescription drug prices and why can I get it cheaper, in the EU and other areas. Is it our delivery system at times, the way that we've done this, and for me, a lot of this has come on in the last 5 decades as we've had a number of competing things that have happened with regards to the delivery system. Is there a way that we can still protect the patents, allow for research and development, and yet make sure that what both the ranking member and the chairman are talking about is that availability to underserved populations? Is there a way to do that without having it a government-owned entity?
I think there is certainly a way to do that without having a government-owned entity. The private sector remains the best engine of innovation in the life sciences. I think there are interesting things we should do. One thing, for instance, is we can think more thoughtfully about how to increase R&D efficiency. The biggest problem in the broader drug development system is so many drugs get to phase 3 clinical trials and then fail, and that's a massive cost for both the companies and the system. If we could focus on public-private partnerships like around translational research that would focus on how we can bring more efficiency to the R&D drug discovery process, that would be a very important way that we could broadly eliminate some of the costs in the drug discovery system.
All right. I look forward to working with my colleagues opposite, and I yield back. I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Norton?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important hearing, particularly for people who represent districts like mine, the District of Columbia. I'm interested in PrEP because it is, of course, the cornerstone of the administration's HIV plan. So it plans to reduce, it plans to increase the use of PrEP from a paltry 10% today to 50% within the next 10 years. So everything is riding on PrEP. I can't resist asking you a question, Mr. O'Day. It's a kind of John Q. public question. Instead of the donations you're offering, even some of the reductions, why not simply lower the price of PrEP?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And obviously, your district is extraordinarily important in terms of HIV elimination and a part of the CDC program that we just agreed for the donation of medicine. So the answer to the question is that if we had lowered the price of our medicines even a decade ago, we wouldn't be sitting here today with the innovations that are changing the face of HIV/AIDS.
Mr. O'Day, I think you testified that your company earned $36 billion in revenue, and you're telling me that at that rate of revenue, we just wouldn't have PrEP at all?
Without the investment back in research, we wouldn't have PrEP today, and we wouldn't also have the advances that we have with the talented scientists at Gilead looking at long-term.
And so that price is justified.
That price,
in order to get back any return on what you have invested in order to develop PrEP. Otherwise, you'd be at a loss.
yes, the revenues are invested to a large percent back into R&D, and I just point out that everything that we start in an early phase R&D trial has a 97% chance of failing. So exactly to Mr. Easel's point, this is a very complex iterative process that requires a lot of investment, but more importantly requires know-how.
This one did fail, just reclaiming my time. So I'd like to go on and find out the feasibility of the use of PrEP by asking Mr. Walensky how feasible is this goal I mentioned to get from 10% to 50% within 50 years, after which you've heard Mr. O'Day testify. How feasible that we'll get there?
Thank you. We aspire to laudable goals. This one's going to be hard, and I will tell you.
Will reducing the price be necessary?
I think we need to put PrEP in the water, is what I think we need to do in order to get this epidemic under control in the places that don't have access to PrEP. I think, you know, the data from South Wales that said that they were able to decrease incidence by 25%. They essentially gave it to almost everybody. They did everything that they could to get PrEP to a lot of people, and so we need to do everything that we can. We know that since PrEP has been available, there has been no dent in incidence. It's been unchanged, and so if that's going to be the case, we need to sort of figure out that 10% access hasn't done anything to incidence.
No effect. Mr. Horn, does it trouble you that the administration's plan relies so heavily on the donation of free drugs from Gilead? We're going to get there with these kinds of donations?
Donations help. They don't solve anything. I'll give you the example. It's like when we have looked at the U.S. response, and I think the response globally, when we took a look at what happened when we had our major innovator manufacturers who were donating drug to low-income countries, that only got us so far. What was really required there was a reduction in price, really that was spurred by robust generic competition to ensure equitable access and affordability to our programs. And so let me be clear. I think the donation will help, but it is not the panacea that we require.
I just want Mr. O'Day to know that everybody affords your donations and charity, but I think we'd actually prefer you to go back to old-fashioned capitalism and reduce the price. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Day, I appreciate you testifying and coming up here. You know, you are being put in a position of being a bad guy, I mean, by the questions you're asked. Your company competes with other drug companies. You're not the only company that took the innovation and the time and the effort to go after a treatment, which, as Congressman Jordan said, you're having the people that ordinarily would not have a chance to live, they're living now. Now, I'm all for lowering prices. You do that through competition and through capitalism. So I want to thank you for doing that and for taking some of these questions, which is really amazing to me. You know, Australia, the drug that's been quoted for $8, where were they when the innovation? Where were they? Why didn't they invent the drug? Why didn't they go through the trials and the studies that you did over time? But Mr. Edsel, you're in a good position to, I guess, answer questions as far as the many times that this country has led in innovation and putting drugs on the market that other countries either couldn't or wouldn't or didn't do. What effect if, go through the trials that fail, and who foots the bill for that with different companies, yours particularly?
I'm sorry. Could you restate the question? I didn't. Could you restate the question? I didn't entirely understand what you're asking.
Could you, well, my question is, part of the reason, you're in a unique perspective on the innovation that's occurring in this country. The U.S. is a leader in innovation, as I've said. You succeed in bringing life-saving drugs to the market. And you improve the lives of Americans who desperately need them, as has been said today. I think part of the reason is because when a drug fails in the pipeline, it's the company primarily who suffers a financial loss. Could you elaborate on this point?
Well, essentially, and that's exactly right. The simple reality is that the process of bringing an innovative new drug to market is lengthy, risky, and extremely expensive. I could quote any number of studies, most recent one from Deloitte, estimating that study shows that over 6 of the past 8 years, the cost to bring an innovative new drug to market has risen. Now the average in 2018 was about $2.1 billion. It really is the private sector of the United States that's the only entity at a large scale in the world who's willing to undertake these incredibly risky and expensive investments and be willing to accept failure rates that, as Mr. O'Dea said, can exceed 95%. We have a system in place to bring talent and capital to the world's most innovative companies to bring breakthrough solutions to market. And I would also ask the committee to understand that their deliberations today, importantly about the price of Truvada, will also have implications for a number of other drugs. Because we care not only, although we care deeply about those patients who suffer from HIV/AIDS, we care about those who are affected by maladies that we currently do not have solutions to. And the genius of America's life sciences innovation system is that we're able to put in place a system that enables us to invest to try to solve challenges that are currently unsolved by the frontiers of medical science. And we're the best country in the world doing that.
You're planning for the future and you're reinvesting to help the lives that you're saving already, making it better. Dr. Walensky, some of my colleagues are advocating for breaking the patent system in the United States as a way to address drugs. Would this work?
Well, one of the things I want to get to is the fact that several people have described that with an earlier patent, an earlier going generic, a year earlier. I want to just emphasize that the only way drugs prices come down in the generic market is if there's generic competition. So the fact that this is going to be, the patent's going to be broken a year earlier and there will be one company making a generic drug is not going to decrease the price of Truvada. Maybe it'll decrease it by 5 or 10%, but we're not going to get the discounts that we need such that the patients who need to access it will be able to access it. I do think that, it's not that I don't believe that the companies need to profit. I do believe that companies need to profit. I do believe we need new drugs. We certainly need them in HIV. We need them in antimicrobials. We need them in a lot of different places. But I do believe that Gilead has already profited enough, especially in the context of a presidential call to end the epidemic here. So I think that would work here.
You think they profited enough, and that's your opinion?
Certainly on this drug, for this indication, I do. I think this is a public health mandate. Not all disease.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're back.
Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My friend from Ohio, the ranking member, has attempted to discredit the purpose of this hearing, and in the process discredit those of us who raise questions, legitimate questions about the pricing of a life-saving drug. I'm here because of one of my best friends. His name was Rick. He developed AIDS in the late 80s when there was no cure. He died when my daughter was just a few months old, in 1991. I spent a lot of time with him during the illness. I saw its progression. I saw his suffering. Terrible symptoms. It ultimately went to his brain, and he started hallucinating. Maybe there was a blessing there because he was not any longer aware of his suffering. He lost his job because of the illness and was uninsured, and he didn't have access to health care. He went to a homeopathic clinic because he was hopeful maybe that would work. It seemed to only make his suffering worse. So, Mr. Jordan, I'm not here to discredit an American company or Mr. O'Day. I'm here for my friend Rick. I'm here to make sure no American has to go through what Rick went through. And that drugs are available to people who are suffering. And I would say to you, Mr. Jordan, that is a legitimate source of inquiry. I'm not going to yield because I'm going to run out of time unless the chairman grants me more time. So I just want to make that really clear. Most of us absolutely subscribe to the thought that a drug company has to recover profits because it recovers costs and legitimate R&D that can produce more life-saving drugs. But the question in front of us is, how much is enough? How high do you go to the point where it becomes a barrier to access? It may help your bottom line, but it doesn't help people like Rick. And I think that's a legitimate form of inquiry. And given that, one notes that right now, the cost of Truvada is about $70 per day if you're paying full freight. Is that correct, Mr. O'Day?
That's correct.
In Canada, it's $5 a day. In Australia, it's $7 a day. And to be fair, in Canada, that's generic. For the branded product, it's $20 a day, not $70. Now, they have different systems, but it's the same drug. Mr. O'Day, when Truvada was first approved as a treatment in 2004, you had a list price of $800 per month. By 2012, when you were approved for preventing HIV transmission, that price had almost doubled to $1,400 a month. In your statement today, you claim you did not increase the price of Truvada when it was approved in July of 2012, correct? That's in your statement.
There was an increase in 2012.
Yes.
But it was over the past since 2004, the average increase has been around 7%.
But in your statement, you said today you did not increase the price of Truvada when it was approved, and I would suggest respectfully that's a little misleading, because you had just raised the price 6 months earlier, and you raised it again 6 months later.
So, Congressman, I understand your point. What I was trying to assert was there was no additional increase to the price as a result of the additional indication.
So let me ask a question in terms of corporate deliberations. I worked in the corporate world for 20 years. When you look at pricing, and when you looked at pricing, did you have a discussion about, okay, corporate profit, we want to maximize our profit, but on the other hand, we also understand our community obligation to suffering people, and so we have to strike a balance here. Does that factor into the pricing of the drug?
Absolutely, Congressman. And there are 4 things that we look at critically when we price a medicine. First of all, what's the value of the medicine to the patient and society? The most recent figure associated with the disease HIV/AIDS, that it can cost on average $880,000 per patient to treat that disease. So that's given into context. The second thing is, what's the comparable treatments that are on the market today? The third, and potentially the most important, is exactly to your point. What are the access limitations that might be created by setting that price? And we anticipate that in advance. And then the fourth one is our commitment to reinvest back in research, not just for this medicine and not just for this disease, but for other terribly devastating diseases that afflict Americans and the globe.
Well, Mr. O'Day, I appreciate that, and I just want to say I hope today's hearing is something that will give you thought and is something that maybe you'll take back to the corporate boardroom to reevaluate the pricing of a drug that so many people need access to. And I want to thank the chairman for having this hearing on behalf of my deceased friend, Rick, your deceased employee, and the millions of Americans who have succumbed to this terrible virus. Thank you.
Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Easel, could you explain in basic terms the law that addresses intellectual property that comes from federally funded research?
Yes, Congressman. It's called the Bayh-Dole Act. It was introduced on a bipartisan basis in 1980. What it does is it gives universities and public research institutions the rights to innovations that stem from federally funded research at their institutions.
And before 1980, before that law, do you have any idea how many patents the U.S. government owned?
Yes, so in 1978, the federal government had licensed less than 5% of the 30,000 patents owned at the time. There was a massive underutilization and a lack of commercialization of intellectual property and knowledge that was sitting in laboratories across the United States.
So before the law, then, there were approximately 30,000 patents that U.S. government owned, only about 5% of which, however, had commercial licensing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, and why is that? It's a lot of patents, a lot of potential great benefits out there, only 5% in the commercial market to go out to the public.
Well, that's right, because, well, first, government institutions and universities were not equipped or expected, or wasn't their intent to incur the risk that would be required to, take those technologies or inventions and bring them to the market as commercializable innovations.
And neither is the government.
No, exactly, neither was government. In fact, an interesting story was from the year 1968 when President Johnson asked Elmer Statz, who was then the Comptroller General of the United States, to analyze how many drugs had been developed from NIH-funded research. And Johnson was stunned when Statz's investigation came back and said that not a single drug had been developed when patents were taken from universities for commercialization by the federal government. A Stats report from 1969 found that we found hundreds of new compounds developed at university laboratories that had not been tested and screened by the pharmaceutical industry because the manufacturers were unwilling to undertake the expense without some possibility of obtaining exclusive rights for further development. It was not until we put in place the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980 that we led to an explosive growth of innovations stemming from federally funded research.
That's my point, exactly where I want to go with this. And so you had the federal government pretty much in charge of all the patents until Bayh-Dole. Then things started changing, and actually patents were able to get into the hands of commercial licensing and thereby get to the needs of the population. Can you briefly explain what the march-in provision is in Bayh-Dole?
Yes, so the march-in provision is language that would, in very specific limited cases, give a government agency the ability to, quote, march in and compel the divulsion of the intellectual property or force additional licenses on a innovation that was result in part from some degree of federal.
And real briefly, what would be, I'm assuming that would be like an emergency.
Yes, so when the architects of the Bayh-Dole Act, Bob Dole and Birch Bayh, designed the legislation in the early 1980s, the reason they conceived of putting in the march-in rights was primarily to ensure that a licensee took the steps to commercialize.
The whole point was to get it to the public when there was a need.
That's correct.
That's correct. So has the march-in provision ever been used by the federal government?
No, it has not.
All right. So what kind of impact would using march-in impact have on research and development?
I think there is a real risk that if we ever used march-in rights, we would substantially stifle the potential of research and development. If a government ever had the capacity to march in decades later and compulsory license the IP underpinning a pharmaceutical drug on the grounds that some of it was contributed by federally funded research, and now, some number of decades later, the government declares that that price is unreasonable, that would give enterprises serious pause about investing the enormous sums required to bring innovative new drugs to the marketplace. It would stifle innovation.
So in other words, there would be a great disincentive for research and development in various companies if they spent the billions of dollars, if they assumed the risk to develop drugs, and then all the while knowing that the federal government could march in and take that patent away from them, you're saying that would massively disincentivize R&D.
That's correct, Congressman. There was a great case from 1995 something called CRADA's, Cooperative Research and Development Agreements. In 1989, NIH inserted a reasonable pricing clause into those CRADAs. The amount of collaboration between industry and government subsequently cratered, and when that requirement for reasonable pricing of a subsequent innovation was repealed, the number of CRADAs instantaneously rebounded in 1995, and we again stimulated effective public-private partnership towards developing new drugs.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Desailly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you to everybody who's been behind this. As somebody who has a pill in my pocket that I will take at 3 o'clock that keeps me alive, that in Australia costs $6. Here in the United States, it costs $400. Johnson & Johnson distributes it. I'm told it's going to $500. But it keeps me alive, so I'm happy that I have health insurance that pays for it. So I've spent a good deal of time in the last 4 years since I was diagnosed with chronic lymphosemic leukemia trying to figure this out. And what's a good, reasonable rate of return to get people from the private sector to invest, and what do we get as taxpayers? NIH has a figure that shows since 1974, the NIH's research has contributed $77 trillion to the U.S. GDP. So having gone out there now multiple times, and Dr. Grant and Mr. O'Day as somebody who's a resident of the Bay Area, I take it now, as somebody who lives in the Bay Area, moved to San Francisco in the 70s, went into the restaurant business. I sit here and think of the friends, the coworkers, the people who worked for me when I owned restaurants, who passed away, and what that did to the culture in San Francisco, having moved there from the west end of Boston. Not a bad facility, by the way, but it's no UCSF. And having one of my oncologists be one of your colleagues, Dr. Kaplan at UCSF, who put some work into this as well. The numbers that I have from a Washington Post article is the research that you got, or the grants that you received, was $50 million, has been said, $50 million from NIH, and then about $17 million from the Gates Foundation. Were there other significant contributions from this company or others to your research?
Gilead did not provide funding. They did donate medications, and it was that donation that justified their listing as authors on the publication cited before. Importantly, my study was not the only study done in PrEP. The CDC funded and performed its own study in Botswana and in Thailand, and the NIH also funded a study called VOICE in Africa. The total U.S. government investment in PrEP is much more than the $50 million for my project. It's in the hundreds of millions of dollars paid by the U.S. government for the development of PrEP.
So Dr. Grant, and actually Mr. O'Day, I think your careers are similar. I remember reading a book, Your Daily Meds, years ago, and that reporter from the New York Times did a wonderful job of doing an investigation of the influx of venture capital into the pharmaceutical industry. That traditionally, 40, 50 years ago, the CEO of pharmaceutical companies were researchers like yourself who went to work for the private sector and moved up the chain of command, and they weren't driven by the market forces that are currently driven. So my question is, and I have an amendment on the floor today that I would like to get bipartisan support, and goes to a little bit of the history that Mr. Ezel was talking about. Ezel, in her investigation, she says that investors looked at professions that people trusted, and people with white smocks people trusted, and that changed the culture. It brought a lot of pressure to get return on investment. Mr. O'Day is somewhat legendary as I read your history about managing pharmaceutical industries. You're on the board of Genentech, you're on the board of the California Life Sciences, which I have great respect for. So my question is, my amendment is actually to get the Academy of Sciences to do a study that does the history, but helps us understand what's the best investment and what's the base that we get from NIH, which I believe is underestimated. And then what's, to my Republican colleagues, what's a reasonable rate of return that will bring investors in to do what they do? So when you look back in your career, how much better would it be now if we had that information and you could do the base, and maybe it would be more efficient when we argue about patent controls in the CDC and this company maybe there's a more efficient way to do this for the consumer, for the shareholder, but mostly importantly for the person whose life is being extended, as they do in Australia, as I understand. They have a discussion about, for instance, this drug, or my drug in Australia is $6 when it's subsidized, when they go through their process, and the risk to the client, if it's fully loaded, it's like $35 a day. So I don't understand why it's $500 a day here.
I don't understand that either, sir.
But we need to find that out, to have a rational conversation. And my colleagues on the Republican side, for a more efficient look at how do you track these investments and get what we want, longer and higher quality lives for American citizens.
You know, I think you're raising all the right points, and it's important to realize that both components of Truvada, tenofovir and emtricitabine, were developed in academic centers using public funding.
Right.
And then those property rights were purchased by Gilead. Now, you know, people at Gilead will say that they invented those products, but in fact they were invented in academic centers using public funds and then purchased by Gilead, who then co-formulated, meaning mixed it into a single tablet. And the mixture in the single tablet is what allowed them to extend their patent rights beyond 2017. And so when we look at innovations, the CDC brought us pre-exposure dosing. They brought us information that the mixture of two drugs was much more important than one drug. And you know, Gilead's invention was really buying products developed with public funding in the academic sector. So this synergy between academics and private industry is important, but I think that we need to be more honest, as you've proposed, about who's doing what in all of this and how much should be charged later.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really hope we continue to pursue this question, because it clearly is a life-determining question that needs to be answered by the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Grothman.
Thank you. Mr. Easel, I kind of want to talk to you just in general, an overview, because I think the hearing today touches not just on a particular drug, but things across the board. And we talk about the interaction between the private drug companies and NIH funding. And it really not until we had this hearing that it occurred to me that we are putting billions and billions of dollars a year into the NIH. And I don't know whether we're getting bang for the buck, or we should be, getting something, some other way to get cures for these diseases. Of the $37 billion we put into NIH, how much of that do you think goes into pharmaceutical development? If you had to guess. We're not going to fact check you.
I'm not an expert on the share of the allocation of the NIH's budget across its 27 research institutes. Their funding of the NIH goes to a number of activities, from training future scientists to looking into very basic research, trying to understand the basic molecular processes of how diseases works, trying to identify biomarkers that could signal future targets for innovation opportunities. But certainly the majority of NIH's research is going into this basic science, trying to understand fundamental molecular activities, and a much smaller portion of their research is going towards development-oriented activities.
Okay. As far as drug development, not just what we're talking about today, but collectively, do you feel, or could you describe the different, do you know how much is spent every year on what we'll call drug development by the private pharmaceutical industry? If you can't give me an answer, we'll ask Mr. O'Day.
In the year 2013, it was $96.5 billion. As I understand, the average over the past 3 years has been about $80 billion per year.
How many?
$80 billion.
80. So we're going at about 80 billion. So in other words, far and away, most of the research in this country done on drug development is done by private industry, and what we get out of NIH is a small fraction.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Could you give me an example of other success stories coming out of NIH?
Well, there are a number. We can look at the invention of Gleevec, treatments for chronic myelogenous leukemia. That was a nice set of case studies that the original research was conducted by Dr. James Allen, I believe at the University of UCLA, I believe. And then some of his basic discoveries into how oncogenes work gave rise to a new form of treating cancers called choke point blocking, that we were able to identify specific antigen growth factors in the body. And then that set of basic research was ultimately licensed to the private sector, and Bristol Myers Squibb invested the hundreds of millions required to now turn that into a first-in-the-world treatment for CML.
Did you feel overwhelming, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, overwhelming the number of pharmaceuticals that are having an effect on our lives or extending lives of people with various diseases? I suppose there's a difference in the type of things that are financed by NIH and the private industry. Could you comment on the differences between which type of drugs each sector goes after, or any reasons why you'd feel one does a better or worse job than the other?
Well, it's the private sector that is primarily incurring the risk of doing the applied research and then conducting the grueling set of 3 stages of clinical trials that are proving the safety and efficacy of that drug. The private sector is the one who is assuring that the formulation is effective and works in the human body. And then, of course, the FDA is working with the private sector to validate that fact. But the system we've put in place is now responsible for the fact that there are 7,000 new-to-the-world drugs under development globally, and it's estimated that at least 3,600 of those are being led primarily by U.S.-headquartered enterprises. There's a lot to do. I'm not satisfied, as wonderful as Mr. O'Day's drug is. We need a cure for HIV/AIDS. We need a cure for various forms of cancer. It's wonderful that there's competition in the marketplace. Mr. O'Day's company faces the loss of competitive existence. It faces existential threats, hopefully from innovators out there who are trying to build a better solution. And I think it's important that we broadly focus on the system we have in place in America that enables competition and enables innovation so that we can try and come up with some of these cures.
Can I give you just one broad question? Does the chairman mind?
The gentleman's time has expired, but you may answer this question.
Okay. My disease of interest is Alzheimer's. Do you feel, as far as we look for a cure there, that'll more likely come from the private sector, from NIH? Or could you comment on that?
My organization actually did a study looking at the economic impact if we were able to come up for a cure for mental diseases. We estimated that the value to society would be as much as $1.5 trillion. I would support an all-of-the-above solution to innovate for cures like Alzheimer's. It's estimated that the real-time net present value of curing Alzheimer's alone would be about $50 trillion for the U.S. economy. So these are massive numbers we're talking about over a period of time. I applaud research that's being supported by nonprofit and foundational actors like the Gates Foundation towards that end. That may be a pathway to innovating such a drug, but I know that there are hundreds of clinical trials ongoing even now to solve various forms of mental diseases being led by the private sector, and that's, I think, probably historically across a broader set of disease states, that's been a more likely pathway to getting towards a solution towards a breakthrough cure.
Spruta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to talk about 2 different issues. One is just the government's commitment under the President's stated objectives to addressing HIV infections, and then also talk after that a little bit about the balance between innovation and drug pricing. So, Mr. Horn, I'll start with you. The President has stated that he wants to reduce infections by 75% in the next 5 years and 90% in the next decade. Yet we've seen systematic attacks on the ACA and funding for community institutions and Medicare and so on. What kind of impact is that going to have in our ability to address HIV infections?
It has a profound effect. We rely on these systems. And we fight very hard for these systems. And I will say that we actually fight very hard against these systems sometimes just to ensure that. But in order to do this, and I think that we realize this when we were just beginning to think about just getting, just maximizing the number of people who are living with HIV, getting them virologically suppressed. What is making that possible, what is getting us there, is the Affordable Care Act, and is all of the systems under the Affordable Care Act. And I think when we do think about this in the context of primary prevention, or PrEP, or just prevention for those who are vulnerable to HIV infection, the same holds true. We absolutely need the ACA, and frankly, we need Medicaid expansion to make that happen.
And actually, if we had universal health care, much of the issues that we're having when talking with Gilead about, and any other drug manufacturer about those costs, many of those disagreements would go away because we would have properly funded system-wide care for all Americans.
That is correct.
And Mr. Ezell, and hopefully I pronounced that correctly, you made the comment earlier that the NIH plays such an important role in the development of new drugs, yet the president has 3 straight years tried to make massive cuts to the NIH. Wouldn't that diminish our opportunity to continue to have innovation in the development of drugs through that public-private partnership?
Absolutely, Congress member. In fact, this is perhaps the most fundamental threat to the U.S. innovation economy. If the United States, essentially today, the U.S. invests the least it has in federally funded R&D as a share of GDP since 1955, to match our investment on average in the 1990s.
65 years, roughly. 64 to be exact.
Correct. On average, to match the federal government's investment in R&D that we averaged in the 1990s, we would have to invest 80% more per year today. And we're seeing that manifest itself within NIH even. The average age of first NIH R01 grant has increased from 34 to 42 years, 8 years later in life. The average success rate has declined from close to 60% in 1960 to under 20% today. And if we don't make that right, we risk losing our international competitiveness.
Thank you. And Dr. Walensky, I'm not sure if this is the appropriate question for you, but I'm just curious, when we look at the societal cost of not doing anything to making sure that we have proper medication and putting a number on that versus the cost of providing these drugs to all those. Has that analysis been done? And if so, is there any indication as to what it would do?
I think we haven't done what the status quo is. We know that if we invest in this, it will be a cost-effective investment. I want to just comment on something Mr. Ezell said, and that is that currently I screen every infectious disease fellow who comes in the door at Massachusetts General Hospital. Nationally, we have 0.7 applicants for every infectious disease position in the country. That is the Indiana HIV outbreak that occurred. There was no infectious disease doctor in that county. And if we don't invest in the NIH to do these things, we will not have those physicians.
Mr. O'Day, heard testimony that the list price is $1,780 to approximately $2,000. That list price, let's just assume for simple math, $2,000. If you sell a monthly prescription for $2,000, does that go to your revenue line?
The $2,000 would go to the revenue line. That's correct.
And then the pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, about roughly what percentage of that $2,000 would be paid to them?
Well, actually, the discounting in the commercial sector is actually quite small because the cost effectiveness of this medicine has not required that discounting. When you look into the public sector, however, we have very deep discounts. So 70 to 80% discounts, for instance, for Medicaid, for ADAP, and for all the government programs.
And one last question. The $1 billion of investment that you noted earlier, is that an ordinary or a capital expense on your balance sheet, on your income statement?
That's ordinary. Yeah, I mean, there could be capital components to that, but the vast majority is recurring expenses year on year, invested into R&D, into people, and into costs that support our research and development.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before we go to Mr. Comer, Dr. Walensky, you said something about 0.7%. Can you say that again? I think I misheard you.
Unfortunately, you probably didn't.
I hope I did.
For every infectious disease fellowship slot that we have in this country, we have 0.7 applicants. There has been a New York Times editorial in the last week, or in the last month, by Matt McCarthy that demonstrates that we are going to have a shortage of infectious disease doctors. We know we are anticipating a shortage of infectious disease doctors. Some of the counties that have had HIV outbreaks, there have been no infectious disease doctors in them. And so, yes, I think we have a public health problem. Part of that is related to NIH funding and seeing, because we are what we call a cerebral field, we rely on NIH dollars to recruit applicants into the field.
Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we've already hit on the important roles of private sector versus public sector in the R&D process, and also the role of having strong patents and the consequences if the government breaks patents on drugs like Truvada. We've also hit on the major scientific and regulatory risks and hurdles you've had to take to market Truvada. Overall, though, I just want to reiterate the great role that Gilead has played in innovations in antivirals, and I hope we can continue to save lives, because that's something that we agree on in a bipartisan way. Switching gears, I want to talk about the President's initiative to eradicate HIV. From what I understand, at the bulk of the Trump administration's plan to eradicate HIV is the ability to locate every American susceptible to HIV and provide a drug and provide help adhering to the daily regime for the rest of their lives. That's no easy task. The cost of doing that will be daunting. About 1.1 million Americans have the virus, and about 1 million are at risk of contracting it. Finding, treating, and keeping them all on treatment, experts estimate, would be more than the administration currently is devoting, even in addition to the $20 billion in federal government, the federal government already spends on HIV prevention and treatment. There are criticisms that if the patent on Truvada remains, the Trump administration's plan to eradicate HIV would cost over $20 billion. So, Mr. O'Day, let me start with a few questions. How many bottles of Truvada has your company, Gilead, donated to the U.S. government?
So our commitment is to donate 2.4 million bottles per year for up to 10 years.
Okay. When, I think Mr. Jordan asked this question, when is a generic version coming onto the market? Do we know?
A generic version of this medicine, Truvada, comes onto the market in September of next year, 2020, and other generics will come on 6 months later.
And you did, as I understand, voluntarily release the patent early.
That's correct. In discussions with, and it was a legal decision at the end of the day, and an important decision to avoid the cost of litigation and to bring this medicine sooner to patients. It's important to note that when the patent expires for Truvada, the next most safe, most effective medicine will take its place in the donation for 2.4 million bottles for the next 10 years. We want to make sure that the uninsured patient population in America has access to state-of-the-art care at all times over this decade.
With those developments, how much closer are we to eradicating HIV?
Well, I think, as been mentioned, I think it's within our grasp. It's clearly challenging. It's as I've tried to articulate, based upon the Gilead programs, it's really not about drug pricing. It's about, in this particular case, it's about the wraparound care. I think the administration's and CDC and HHS's efforts to reduce by 70% in 5 years and 90% in 10 years is within our grasp, but it does require a holistic approach to the wraparound care. Many people have talked about Australia here, which I think is interesting to look at in some regards. In Europe, generics have been available for 3 years, and even with the lower cost of medicines in Europe, we've seen very little increase in HIV PrEP, which goes to show you that there are many, many elements of this system that have to be invested in.
Right. What proposals currently would hinder the progress of eradicating HIV or any prospect of a cure or vaccine to HIV? What proposals have you heard out there that would hinder that?
Well, I think that's, I mean, the current initiatives focus on the available antiretrovirals, which are very effective, but have drawbacks in terms of getting into the hands of patients at the right time. So what our scientists are doing is they're working on longer-term medicines. Those could be delivered once a month, once every 3 months, long-acting, which I think could help us desperately with this solution of HIV elimination, and eventually the cure. And the cure is still, I wouldn't say within our grasp today. There'll need to be a lot of failures to get there. But we're firmly committed at Gilead to investing in that research, to keep having the 90% failure rate, and finding eventually that 3% cure, which we're firmly committed to. We won't rest until we get there.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a Washington Post article from 2016 entitled, "The Drug Company That Shocked the World with Its Prices Dodged $10 billion in Taxes," report says.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. We've talked about saving lives, but as a corporate executive, Mr. O'Day, let's talk about money. Just as you're responsible for your budget, I'm responsible for our taxpayers' money, and in this case, our worlds collide. Mr. O'Day, how much does Gilead spend per year in direct costs for patient care for people with HIV and AIDS?
I don't have the exact figure, Congresswoman, but it's in the tens of millions of dollars.
You pay for direct care?
We fund community support groups that support patients in a variety of different ways. We're the largest corporate donor to community funding.
That's great. Is it true that you get a tax break for those corporate donations?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So effectively, you don't spend money on direct patient care. But do you know how much the U.S. government does?
No, we do spend money on patient care. We may get some tax benefits to that, just to correct.
Okay.
But we absolutely spend, and we have an outflow in our P&L that is associated with those funds.
Do you know how much the U.S. government spends on that treatment for patients with HIV or AIDS?
What I know is that the current plan for HHS and CDC has earmarked for the 2020 budget somewhere around $290 million for the HIV elimination program. Now, the fact that Gilead will donate all of the medicine
hold
to
up.
that program.
Hold up. So what the U.S. government pays in direct care, this is through Medicaid and Medicare, is $21.5 billion. So it's a much higher number than what we're adding to the budget for research and elimination. But anyway, it's estimated that $470,000 in lifetime costs is what it takes to treat someone with HIV infection, and now we have 40,000 people with new HIV diagnoses in the country each year. And so that cost to our taxpayers is going to continue to rise. So as you heard from the title of the article I submitted, Gilead is notorious for not even paying its fair share in taxes that go towards HIV treatment. Gilead reported its 2018 financial performance to the SEC on February 26th. It showed that the company had revenue of about $22 billion, that number sounds familiar, in 2018, with about $31 billion in cash available. So I want to take a look at how Gilead's using some of its profits. Mr. O'Day, you just joined Gilead Sciences earlier this year, is that right?
That's correct.
Your initial compensation package was reportedly worth about $30 million, including both cash and stock options. So the company agreed to pay you $30 million just for taking the job, is that right?
That's correct. I mean, I should articulate that half of that was for compensation that I gave up for my previous assignment, and half.
Okay, but it's $30 million for taking the job. So just out of curiosity, do you know what the median income is for a U.S. worker, according to the BLS?
I do not offhand.
It's $46,800, or 1/6 of 1% of what your signing bonus was. Just thought you'd want to know that. Gilead has a long history of paying windfall amounts to its corporate executives. In 2013, Gilead's former CEO, John Martin, earned almost $180 million. His salary for the year was $15.4 million, but he cashed out almost $160 million in stock options that year. Mr. Martin appears to have timed his pay well. According to Gilead's 2013 annual report to shareholders, Gilead had, quote, record total revenues in 2013 of $11.2 billion. 2013 was the year that Gilead's blockbuster drug Sovaldi received FDA approval, correct?
I believe so.
Sovaldi is a Hep C drug that also made headlines for costing $1,000 per pill. I want to turn to another Gilead executive, your direct predecessor, John Milligan. He made a little less than you, just $15 million. I understand Mr. Milligan resigned in 2018, but he didn't lose his salary. In fact, he received what's called a golden parachute, meaning that the company paid him extra just for resigning. Mr. Milligan had previously received stock options that were not worth anything because the company's stock had gone down. But thanks to a separation agreement between Mr. Milligan and the company, he was paid an additional severance that earned him a total of $26 million just for resigning from the company. That's true, right, Mr. O'Day?
As far as I understand, those decisions are made by the board of directors.
Of course. Gilead's a private company, and it can pay its corporate executives whatever it likes, but Gilead also makes a life-saving drug that it has kept a U.S. monopoly on. We've heard today about people who are not accessing this drug because they cannot afford it. We've heard about local public health officials that are straining under the financial burden of providing this drug to everyone else that needs it to stay healthy. And this drug, which has generated billions of dollars for Gilead, was developed using tens of millions of dollars of federal funds. So what Gilead chooses to do with its profits really does matter to all of us, and I'll say that the millions and millions of dollars to corporate executives, I take some issue with. Thank you.
Mr. Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I came to this hearing hoping that we might have a hearing where we spent some time diving into some of the tough questions instead of preening and posturing for cameras, attacking people for making profit in a capitalist society. But that's what I just heard in rants for the last 5 minutes. Now, Mr. O'Day, do you make brentuximab? Do you know what brentuximab is?
I do not. I'm sorry, Congressman.
Brentuximab vedotin is the drug that I took when I was suffering from Hodgkin's lymphoma, a drug that was created, built, manufactured, developed, designed, created by a private company that made a lot of money. And I'm really glad they did. I hope they make a lot more. And I hope they make a lot more drugs to save a lot more people and distribute a lot more drugs around the world to save a lot more people. Now, it is a reasonable question when patents expire, when they should expire, when they shouldn't expire. It is a reasonable question how much money the NIH has and is investing and how much we should factor that into the patent life. But to sit here and attack the capitalistic system that produces and distributes medicines that's saving lives around the world, I mean, it is just offensive. I mean, I just cannot possibly understand why we're spending time sitting here while I listen to people lecturing companies about making money. I hope you make a lot of money. It is a reasonable question what patent length should be. I'd like to have that conversation and dialogue. I don't know whether it should be 1 year, 5 years, 17 years. I don't know. Let's have that debate. I don't know how much we should factor in that NIH puts in 400 million, 50 million, I don't know what it is, whatever the number is that's gone into the production of this drug. I don't know how much went into merging these two, putting them together, and then you guys distribute it versus how much NIH has done. Fine, let's have this conversation. But this absurd attack on profit being evil is undermining the entire ability for us to have a rational conversation about the serious questions that are actually before us here. We don't go down. How much cash on hand does Apple have? $245 billion. How much has Apple done to go cure health? Is Apple in the business of providing direct health care? Mr. O'Day?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Right. Are you in that business?
Yes, we are.
Do you provide medicine or do you run hospitals?
Our role is to bring breakthrough medicines to patients with devastating diseases.
Right. Do you hire doctors to go out and provide care, or do you, for the most part, design, develop, manufacture medicine?
My colleagues and I at Gilead are exclusively focused on the design and development of medicines and getting them in the hands of patients.
And if I may, Mr. O'Day, you employ 10,000 people at Gilead. There are some of the 1.2 million individuals in America's who are employed by America's pharmaceutical companies who earn an average salary of $122,000. This is an industry that supports over 5.5 million workers across the U.S. economy, considering direct and indirect effects. And it's an industry that supports a high-value added sector of the economy, high-value exports.
Yeah, but
and,
whatever,
people live their
profit is
lives.
evil, right? Making money is apparently evil. Because never mind all those people you just talked about who are making money and able to pay for their jobs and their salaries and be able to send their kids to school and be able to buy their houses in our system. This is somehow the wrong thing for us to do. I mean, again, like, can we have a roundtable discussion? Happy to sit down with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and this side of the aisle. And let's have 2 hours, 3 hours. Let's get whiteboards up and let's go through all of this stuff and come to a reasonable consensus on some of these tough questions about patents. It is a real concern. But can we dispense with the ridiculousness of hostility toward profit? It is a good thing that Apple makes a crap ton of money making these things so that we can have them and distribute them and use them for great additions and benefits to the world. And it is the same thing in the medicine.
Before we go on to, who's next? Come on. Mr. Raskin, just a moment. Mr. Roy, I've been here since, oh, he's gone. Mr. Roy, I've been here since 9:45. I've heard every syllable that has been stated here, and I'm sorry you had to leave. But I think the committee on both sides have asked reasonable questions. And nobody, I'm not beating up on anybody for profit. We're just trying to make sure we understand what the American tax dollars are paying for. We want to understand why the price is so high. And we're trying to understand how we can get the 90% of people who need this life-saving medication, how we can get it to them. And we, as a matter of fact, I've applauded Gilead for their research and what they've been able to accomplish. Now we're just trying to expand it, and Mr. O'Day has made it clear that they are trying to figure out how to expand treatment, the number of people also who will have access to this medication. So in fairness to the committee, I just wanted to make that clear to my colleague. Now we will hear from Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that thoughtful comment, and I want to follow up on Mr. Roy's very interesting and provocative statement there, because I think what we are trying to figure out is precisely what are the various public and private ingredients that go into our pharmaceutical system. My friend Mr. Roy doesn't have to look across the aisle to find people who are upset with big pharma. President Trump himself has said that the pharmaceutical industry is getting away with murder. Pharma has a lot of lobbies, a lot of lobbyists, and a lot of power, and there's very little bidding on drugs. So I think that it's not just members of this side of the aisle that have noted some problems in the current system. But Mr. O'Day, let me come to you, because we know that the taxpayers through the NIH, which is proudly in my district, in the 8th Congressional District in Maryland, put in $49 million, and the Gates Foundation put in tens of millions of dollars more into funding the development of Truvada as a method for preventing HIV. And I think a lot of the discussion here is about the fact that tens of billions of dollars have been earned by your company, but how much did Gilead spend on researching and developing Truvada as PrEP specifically, as a prevention drug?
Thank you, Congressman. So it's hard to tease out some of the PrEP activities with the other activities, because at the end of the day, this medicine reduces the viral replication. It's the same mechanism, if you like, for treatment as it is for
Okay,
PrEP.
so how much did you guys put into that part of the process.
Well, 1.1 billion over the course of Truvada's development, which was really for all indications associated.
Okay, and then the infusion of money that came from the taxpayers of the NIH was essential for the development, I think you would agree, of Truvada for the purpose of preventing HIV.
Yes, the know-how and knowledge that Gilead put in, the investment from the NIH of the 50 million, the greater than 80 million donation from the Gates Foundation, all this was important to provide the body of evidence.
Terrific. Okay, so we can't imagine this is some kind of Ayn Rand fantasy where the private sector did it all on its own, right? Would you agree with me about that?
I would agree, absolutely.
Okay, so what has been the total revenue from Truvada as PrEP?
The total revenue for Truvada as PrEP is difficult to kind of tease out. Again, we've talked about the number of 36 billion globally for the entire medicine, but it's very hard because the medicine is prescribed by physicians.
Gotcha.
You often don't know whether it's PrEP or treatment.
When you set the price for it for U.S. payers, did you take into account the role of taxpayer funding in the development of the drug?
When we set the price for Truvada originally, we took into account a variety of things, including the impact upon the healthcare system, the ability to make sure we get access.
All right, but you didn't take into account the fact that the public was one of the investors in the research.
Well, at the time we priced the medicine, the public had very little to do with the invention of this medicine.
Okay. So, and you're choosing now to donate some drugs rather than reduce drug prices. Will you claim the donation as a tax deduction, as you testified that you did habitually? There's nothing wrong with it, but it will be claimed as a tax deduction, presumably.
That's what my understanding is at a cost of goods level.
Okay. One of the shocking revelations from the Senate Finance Committee's investigation into the pricing of your hepatitis C product was that the $1,000 a day price you settled on was based on seemingly extraneous or arbitrary factors like the likelihood of a public outcry at a certain price point, or the likelihood of receiving a letter from a member of Congress, or the likelihood of facing a congressional committee in a hearing like this. Did you use those same political factors in setting the price for Truvada?
So, Congressman, I was not at the company at the time, but I've looked into those details. I think the overriding factors for the setting of the price for the HCV medicine were based upon both the cost of current treatment at the time and the innovation of bringing this together in a curative setting for 12 weeks of therapy to cure the disease, a huge step up from what was done in the past. Those are the prevailing means that go into account when we price.
And then finally, last question, just to follow through on the point Mr. Roy raised, and I'm sorry he's not here for it, but do you think it's inappropriate in a constitutional democracy where the public invests in scientific and medical research and helps to produce pharmaceutical drugs that the public relies on, for that factor to be taken into account in the pricing and distribution of pharmaceutical drugs?
Well, I think it's very important that you consider the access question. Will the medicine get to the patients that need it, including in the government sector and the government-funded healthcare sector, as well as the private sector? So absolutely, I think you need to take a variety of things into account.
Okay, thank you. And I wish I could ask you about that access, maybe if we get another round, but I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Cummings and Ranking Member Jordan, and thank all of you all for being here today. In my home county of Cabell County, there has been an increase in HIV cases. In March, there were 28 confirmed cases, and in April, that number has risen to 44. This number is a sharp uptick from the case where we only had 8 cases annually over the last 5 years. Unfortunately, those most impacted are intravenous drug users, which is a terrible result of the opioid crisis that has devastated so many communities across the United States. I'm very glad that President Trump is taking the issue of HIV seriously and has secured the donation of the $2.4 million from Truvada for the Centers of Disease Control, and thank you for doing that. Mr. O'Day, if a patient cannot afford Truvada, are there precautions in place to ensure access?
Yes, absolutely. So if they have private insurance and they can't afford their copay, they can apply to our copay assistance programs, and 98% of patients that have done that pay nothing out of pocket. And then if they are either uninsured or struggle with their medicine, we have a medicine assistance program which essentially evaluates their financial needs and provides it for free.
Thank you. Can you explain how the new version of tenofovir, if that's how you pronounce it,
Tenofovir, right.
Tenofovir, was an improvement to patients, and what new benefits does it provide?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. So what you're referring to is actually a completely separate medicine from tenofovir. It's a medicine that's called, abbreviated as TAF. And this is now the advancement that we've seen in both treating and preventing HIV/AIDS is that people living with AIDS or people subject to AIDS have the ability to take these medicines now for decades. Tenofovir, when taken that long, a certain subset of patients have issues with their kidney or with bone disease on such a chronic basis because we've essentially transformed the disease to such a long-term illness. So the new medicine, so-called TAF, which will be combined again with FTC and other agents, has a much lower incidence of these side effects and is really designed for, if you like, the new generation of medicines that will allow patients to be on this longer term without having to worry about other debilitating side effects that they could get from their medicines. We've launched this now into the treatment of HIV setting with a medicine called Biktarvy, and we'll be bringing this innovation. It's right now filed with the FDA, and we will hope to have a positive approval by the end of this year for patients that are eligible for PrEP. So this innovation, this new medicine that was completely discovered and developed by Gilead scientists is now kind of the next evolution of care for HIV patients.
How long did it take you to do that?
Oh my gosh, well, this was back in the 1990s that we started this, so it's been more than 2 decades, and part of that $6 billion investment that we've had so far in HIV.
Wonderful. Would any new patents prevent generics from being created against the original version?
No, it's a completely separate medicine. It has nothing to do with the patents of Truvada. It's patent protected from this new innovation that took decades to produce.
Thank you. Mr. Ezell, do you foresee a future where the NIH could take on the entire of the drug development process from start to finish?
I simply do not think that would be the case. First, the capacities are not there. The NIH focuses on basic scientific research. What industry is really bringing to the table is the development aspect of it, doing the applied research, conducting the clinical trials. Now, this has been proposed. Dean Baker, for instance, has written that, quote, we could expand the public funding going to NIH or other public institutions to extend their charge beyond basic research to include developing and testing drugs and medical equipment. But Baker estimates that were we to try to do that, we would likely, quote, it would be necessary to increase the amount going to NIH by at least $60 billion a year in order to, quote, replace the funding currently supported through patent monopolies. So no, I don't think that's tenable. I don't think we're going to increase NIH funding by $60 billion a year, especially if we can't increase pass the gas tax. And more beyond that point, I think there is very little reason to make that dramatic of a change to a system that, as I've tried to say today, is in fact the world's most effective and productive at generating new-to-the-world cures.
Thank you.
Mr. Garner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for working to have this hearing. Mr. O'Day, I want to try to be constructive and not score political points or embarrass you, but just get some facts and see if we can make some progress of your commitment. The New York Times wrote that Truvada was developed significantly by taxpayers. Is that a true statement?
I think that's really inadequate, inaccurate, I should say.
So you disagree with the New York Times editorial board?
Yes.
And why is it not a true statement?
Because the medicine was developed and discovered within Gilead. Now, some of my colleagues have mentioned that we license in some initial compounds on this. That's important. Those were very early stage ideas on the product. In the case of TDF, which is one of the components of Truvada, it was not a drug that at the time, and it went through many iterations before it got there.
Did you benefit at all from the study that was funded, $49 million by NIH and the Gates Foundation, in terms of understanding the drug could be used for preventing HIV?
Absolutely. Of the $1.1 billion we invested, I think that it was an important contribution to supporting the HIV PrEP story at the time, and I'm grateful for Dr. Grant's leadership.
Grateful is good. Have you paid them anything?
Well, I think there's different ways to look at contribution to society. I mean, we have...
No, I mean, I'm sure they appreciate the compliments, but, you know, usually if I get something, I pay something for it. I'm just curious. It's a simple answer, yes or... Usually I don't like yes or no questions, but this one is pretty yes or no. Did you pay them money or not?
The donations that were provided by NIH and the Gates Foundation did not come with terms suggesting that...
No, I'm not saying that they required it. I'm just asking, so you didn't pay them anything for that?
No, I think it's in the interest of public health to advance a foundational medicine for additional indications.
It absolutely is. The difference is 99.9% of us don't get to profit when it's in the interest of public health. We have, you know, you've acknowledged that this is something that you use to profit, and you haven't paid them back. I mean, that's your decision. I just want to get the facts. One thing I want to get at, are you, I appreciate that you're going to donate these 200,000 drugs. Can you assure us that you're not going to claim a tax write-off for those?
You know, those will show up on our P&L balance
So you will
sheet.
claim a tax write-off. Can you assure us that you will only deduct the manufacturing cost?
Yes, I can assure you of that.
So you're not going to you're going to deduct $6. You're not going to deduct the
The $6 figure is not accurate.
Okay, but you aren't going to deduct the $2,000. You're going to deduct something
That's
closer
correct.
to $6.
That's correct.
So it's inaccurate that you would try to get $1 billion tax deduction.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so let me ask you this. One thing that I think you could commit to that would go a long way. There is some misunderstanding on the $200,000 that you've pledged to the president, and they are saying that that also includes people who are already on your financial aid programs. Can you commit that those 200,000 drugs are going to be in addition to the ones of people who are already part of your financial aid programs?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to note.
So you are making that commitment. So in addition to the people you have on financial aid, you're going to do 200,000 new ones, and you're committing today that you're not going to deduct anything beyond the cost on your
That's correct.
deduction.
We'll continue to serve patients through our medical assistance program. Today we have 20 to 30,000 a year. This is an additional 200,000. Plus we continue to support all the copay. So back to, you know, do we give back, you know, to you know, inventions that are supported in us? I mean, the answer is yes, in different forms.
Well, I'm glad you've made a commitment, because the New York Times editorial page, you know, they'll be happy to know. I mean, there was legitimate concern about what tax deduction you're going to take. It seems you're not going to take that. You're going to do 200,000 in addition. Now, if you would just commit to paying back something to the CDC, I think it would go a long way. Any final thoughts?
Well, I think, you know, we are collaborating with the CDC on the entirety of the program. So I think this is a partnership. It's one where we provide resources, intellectual know-how, medicine. The government provides funding to support. We're all in this together to get to the HIV elimination. So I think there's give and take on a variety of sides. Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Mr. Horn, has Gilead invested approximately $1.1 billion in developing Truvada? Is that an accurate number?
I'm sorry?
Approximately, did Gilead spend 1.1 billion developing Truvada?
I can't confirm or deny that.
Can you answer that, Mr. Ezell?
I would defer to Mr. O'Day, who's from the company. I do not know myself how much.
Okay, I was wondering if this was common knowledge. Mr. O'Day, can you clarify?
I can confirm.
According to our research, it cost 1.1 billion.
Yes,
to develop.
I can confirm that. Yes.
And that drug has been quite successful at treating HIV and AIDS, correct?
It's been a cornerstone of HIV treatment. Yes.
Thank you. The drug Descovy, are you currently investing a great deal of money, perhaps on a similar level, to develop Descovy? Is that at phase 3 right now?
The phase 3 trials read out. They were presented at the AIDS meeting in March. It's now been submitted to the FDA for the
How much money are you making on Descovy right now?
I don't have that number on the top of my head. I apologize.
Is it being sold?
Back to you. It is being sold for the treatment indication, but the prevention indication will be new later this year.
Very well. And that's because it's in phase 3 right now.
Yes, finished phase 3.
And GS9131, is that an HIV/AIDS drug?
I believe so. I'm still getting the numbers down.
It's in phase 2. Is money being spent to develop that drug for HIV and AIDS?
I'm just not familiar with this particular number, Congressman, so I apologize. But we have a variety of medicines in phase 2 right now.
According to my research, you have 4, including Descovy, you have 5 HIV/AIDS drugs being developed, 3 in phase 1, 1 in phase 2, 1 in phase 3.
Yes, that sounds right.
Is that reflective of? So the drugs that are in phase 1, these 3 drugs that are in phase 1 to treat HIV and AIDS, is there money, tremendous amounts of money being invested in the development of those drugs?
Well, we spend about $3.5 billion a year on R&D, and around 40% of that goes into HIV/AIDS at this stage. So yes, there's significant investment.
And prior to these drugs that are in development right now being sold and marketed at including levels that are being questioned by this oversight committee, I think appropriately so. We must protect the American people. We wouldn't want gouging, would we? And yet this clearly indicates, our research indicates, that you're investing a tremendous amount of money right now into drugs being developed for to treat HIV and AIDS, which are not being sold. So you're not making money on these drugs, you're spending money on these drugs.
Congressman, and many of those will fail, unfortunately. But it's the nature of innovative research.
The ones that succeed and they go to market and they help Americans, perhaps millions of Americans, as Truvada has, is that the corporation's only window to recoup and retain monies to invest in further research and development? Is that not a logical formula?
Absolutely. That's basically our contract with society. We invest a tremendous amount in R&D at a high failure rate. Those that succeed, we have a limited patent life to recoup the investment back into investing it on finding cures for devastating diseases. And then it becomes generic and broadly available to society.
In the interest of time, thank you for clarifying. I have limited time. According to our research, besides the 5 HIV/AIDS drugs that are in development, in what you refer to as in the pipeline, you have 28 other drugs that are in the pipeline at various phases of development. Of those 28 additional drugs, would it be fair to say that scores of millions of Americans could be helped with diseases that we currently suffer?
Well, we're certainly hoping, yes. We're working on some of the most devastating diseases.
And when a drug is under development, is there any guarantee that it will become a profitable drug for the company?
Quite the contrary. In phase 1, 95% failure rates. Phase 2, 85% failure rates. Phase 3, 50% failure rates are the average. In fact, we just had a phase 3 trial for a devastating disease called NASH.
Thank you for clarifying, sir. I think it's clear that
went to gay white males. The African American community was pretty much left out. And so I'm trying to figure out, when I heard those numbers, I'm just trying to figure out who's going to cover the African American communities and how, and whether, when you all make those decisions, you know, about distribution, where does that go? I mean, in other words, where do the drugs go? And what role do you all play in making sure that there is some equitable distribution? And I want you to understand, I've heard a lot of talk here this morning about how people are beaten up, and it's not about beating up. It's about being thankful that we have a medication that can do just about everything but finally cure it, AIDS, and wanting it to get to everybody that it can get to. I mean, it's as simple as that. So, Ms. Dr. Walensky, I'm sorry.
Great. Yeah, so a couple of comments on that. We know there are about 39,000 new HIV infections in the United States per year. The most recent data that we have, we know 80% of those new infections were in persons of color. We know that
80%?
80% were in persons of color. We know that of the new infections in 2017, 43% were in African Americans. African Americans make up 13% of this population. We know that African Americans suffered over 53% of the deaths of HIV and AIDS. And we know that PrEP is getting to largely gay white men, which it needs to get to, and about 75%, but only about 10% of its consumers are people of color.
No, Mr. O'Day, what can we do about that?
This is a dire need. We completely agree. And part of the program we've just agreed to with the CDC is focused on 48 hotspot counties, 7 rural states, the District of Columbia and San Juan, Puerto Rico. These are areas predominantly in the southern United States where the African American incidence we're not reaching and getting to. So we've had programs that are continually focused on supporting the community support services that are underway now, but we have much more we have to do to get to these communities. It's to make sure that the medicine is not the barrier in these communities, but beyond that, it's making sure we provide the services to both address the issues relative to inequalities in the healthcare system, lack of education, stigma associated with the minority and African American communities. We need to do more. We're fully committed to rolling up our sleeves to be a part of that. In fact, I just received an email overnight from an incredible organization in Jackson, Mississippi, that supported 400 patients to get PrEP over the past 6 years. It's a small start. There's so much more to do. When they started, they were the only organization in Mississippi that did this. And fortunately, they have a system there where once they identify patients, and they're now using telemedicine to try to identify patients, built into their protocols are the ability to access the Gilead support services. And I'm pleased to say that they said of the 400 patients, none of the 400 had a financial problem with getting the medicine. But we need to do this in so many other communities, and that's why we're rolling up our sleeves and hoping, and not just hoping, but committing to the CDC initiative and others to get to this community.
Mr. Presley. Ms. Presley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Ocasio-Cortez and all the advocates who made this hearing possible. And Mr. Chairman, just picking up on some of your commentary and the comments of our colleague across the aisle who was very impassioned, and I have an equitable amount of outrage about the fact that people are dying. This is not about the vilifying of profit. This is about the vilifying of choosing profit over people. And if we know that a new person is infected every 15 minutes, and we've been here 2.5 hours, that's 10 more people who have been infected. And so we have an administration, the occupant of this White House, who sets an aspirational and achievable goal to end this epidemic, and yet We don't have enough infectious disease doctors. We have a cost-prohibitive, life-saving drug, and it is not equitably being accessed. So that sounds like an unfunded mandate, and we've been here before. And this is the Oversight and Reform Committee. And so it is our job to hold everyone from, I served on the city council before, but anytime profit over people, whether it's developers or pharmaceutical companies, are engaging in those practices, we're here to shine a light on that and to keep us all accountable. So that's the role of this committee. We should be furious about what we've heard here today. This is the world's wealthiest nation. There are 40,000 new HIV diagnoses each year. In my home state of Massachusetts, there have been over 140 new HIV cases since 2015, 8 new cases in Boston over the last 6 months. Now, we've heard a lot of sobering and damning statistics here, but I don't want us to get lost in the numbers and allow that to dominate the conversation, because this is about people, our family members, our neighbors, our friends, our constituents. Like my constituent Matthew. He lives in Somerville. He's a gay man. And Matthew knows he's at a higher risk of getting HIV, and for 3 years he's been fortunate enough to be on PrEP. His insurance coverage gives him access to the drug at an affordable rate. However, he lives in constant fear that a job change will push it out of reach for him. There are millions of Matthews in our country for whom PrEP allows them to stand in their truth, safety, and unencumbered by the fear of contracting HIV. But unlike Matthew, there are millions more who need it and still cannot afford it. It's been 40 years since the first HIV case in the U.S., and this disease still remains a global public health challenge. And as reminded to all of us by our chair in your earlier commentary, particularly for women and queer people of color. It is my opinion that, Gilead, you have used your power to manipulate our patent systems, monopolize the marketplace, to line your shareholders' pockets, and I think that's shameful. Dr. Walensky, you have studied HIV transmission closely, and as a physician at Mass General Hospital, you were on the front lines of this epidemic. Since we're short on time, yes or no, do you agree that by failing to get PrEP in the hands of those most at risk, including people who inject drugs, we undercut our ability to eradicate this disease?
Yes.
Thank you. Can you speak to how substance abuse disorders, specifically for those who inject drugs with needles, have heightened the need for greater access to PrEP?
Our hospital is full of injection drug users right now. We have doubled our consult volume in the last decade, much due to injection drug use. There's been an outbreak in Lawrence and Lowell, as you know, in Massachusetts, that was reported in the MMWR by the CDC. An HIV outbreak, I should say. Yes, we need PrEP for all people at risk.
Mr. O'Day, Gilead plans to donate millions of bottles of PrEP and bring a generic product to the market in the next few years. At face value, this seems like a good idea, although 2 years is 2 years too long. But the CDC estimates only a fraction of the 1.1 million people who need PrEP have access to it. The donation your company announced would reach even less people. Now, I recognize your company's efforts to provide financial assistance for people without insurance who can't afford it, but given the uptick in HIV infection, these efforts simply don't keep pace. They don't go far enough. Mr. O'Day, can you guarantee that the donated medications will go to people who do not already have access to the drug?
Yes.
Thank you. In Canada and Australia, Truvada is sold for less than $10 a pill. It seems to me if your company wanted to, you could make the drug affordable for everyone. What has stopped your company from lowering the price to a comparable rate in the U.S.?
The patent exclusivity ends, as you know, in September of next year, we will, the pricing between the countries is very different. It's a very heterogeneous systems between the United States and in other countries. And the pricing, as said in the United States, takes into account the innovation it brings, the cost of the health care of treating an HIV patient, the ability to invest back in research and development, and then also to make sure our access programs are effective and that patients in America do not go without receiving this life-saving medicine.
Well,
it's greed.
Yeah, okay, so I was gonna say, just, respectfully, in that every 15 minutes a new person is infected, the more time we waste, the more lives that we are losing. And again, this is an aspirational and achievable goal, and so it is really infuriating. There are clearly many barriers people are facing in accessing this life-saving medication, and price should not be one of them. Gilead can make PrEP more affordable in the U.S. and therefore more accessible if you want to. If there is the moral courage and the fortitude and the commitment to do so. Your failure to do so is indefensible. Your company brings in record-level profits while holding hostage a drug that could end this epidemic. There isn't a country in this world where this type of greed and conduct would be tolerated, so I'm not sure why we tolerate it in this one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tlaib.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for always supporting us, especially us, a new class of women that have come into this United States Congress. It speaks volumes to your character. I also want to thank my sister from New York, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the incredible advocates that are behind her in making sure that we always speak truth to power. What is evil, Mr. Chairman? And I talked with you about this. What is evil is that people are dying a painful death all because of corporate greed. How much profit is enough, Mr. O'Day? When does it become immoral? And alone in my district, I have the third largest population of those infected in the state of Michigan. And as I think about you saying you're helping folks, I look at numbers because it's important. And when you say you're going to provide assistance, 200,000 people, when 1.1 million people need your assistance. It's baffling. And I agree with Dr. Lord. I agree that Truvada belongs to all of us. And it's our responsibility in this chamber to make sure that we are putting people before profit. And it's really absurd that as I hear my colleagues defending this practice over the American people that brought us here, it's disheartening. Because in the last 5 months, I don't care which committee I go to, corporate greed is the issue, always. It is always about the money and about profit. And as Mr. Chairman has constantly always said, there's no problem with that. But when does it become immoral? When does it become so unjust that we're seeing our neighbors die because drugs are just not accessible to them? Drugs that we created, the federal government, on behalf of the people. And so I just want to urge Mr. O'Day to please take Dr. Lord's recommendations. This is your time to do what's right for the people and do what's right for our country. And with that, I want to yield to my sister from New York, who is, again, such a shed of light in this time of darkness in our country that is constantly, always putting people before profit, and that's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you. That's incredibly too generous. Thank you. And I'd like to thank my sister and colleague from Michigan, because I see you go home every weekend and connecting with your community and really bringing yourself to hold that space and feel what your constituents feel. Mr. O'Day, I just want to clarify that and let you know that this isn't about you, and I'm not here to vilify the work that you've done, because you are responding to a set of incentives. And you could, resign today. There would still be someone that would come up and occupy this seat, responding to those same incentives, making the same decisions that you make. So this isn't about you as an individual or who you are or your character. This is about the system of incentives that we have set up. And when it comes to who to blame for this, I don't blame you. I blame us. I blame this body. Because every single developed country in the world guarantees healthcare as a right except us, except the United States, because we can't get it together, because we don't have the fortitude to kick pharmaceutical lobbyists outside of our congressional offices. We have a leader here, Mr. Sarbanes, who has led in the role of money in politics. We can't even reform our own political system to make sure that we are more responsive to the people and the electorate that we seek to lead and whose votes we ask for. And so this isn't your fault. This is our fault, because for some reason, For some reason, the conclusion that every single other Western or rather developed country in the world has come to, we haven't been able to come to. In Australia, PrEP is $8 a month. In the United States, it's almost $2,000 a month because we have legislated a set of incentives and we have legislated a system that allows that to happen. 10 out of every 10 people that need PrEP, 9 of them cannot access it. And that is largely due to the price. We heard earlier today an impassioned plea about profits and about how a corporation like Apple should be able to enjoy that. Well, I know a woman, her name is Amy Villela, and her daughter died because she went to a hospital and told them that she wasn't insured. And they said, come again in a month when you do have insurance. Well, her blood clot didn't wait a month. Her daughter died at 22 years old. And the rub of it was that her daughter, I believe, might have actually been insured and just didn't know it because she was in between jobs. And so what Amy says, what Ms. Villela says is, this is a commodity. Her daughter's life was not. People's lives are not commodities. When we talk about economics, there's something known as a demand curve with elasticity. And with every other commodity, you can say, how much is this phone worth to you? And you can say $100, $200. You can buy a Nokia phone. You can not have a phone at all. But you cannot ask the question, how much will you pay to be alive? How much will you pay to live? Because the answer is everything. The answer is you will pay $10, you will pay $1,000, you will go into debt, you will do anything to live. And that is what makes the price of medicine different than the price of an iPhone. Thank you very much.
Time has expired. Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm tempted to just say amen and stop talking. But I do have a couple of questions I'd like to get on the record. Mr. O'Day, this new drug that's going through the process, Descovy, is that how you say it?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's based on this component that has TAF as opposed to TDF.
Correct.
Is that something you're going to pursue exclusivity on in terms of the patent around that once it's finished?
It's a brand new medicine and has a
new.
patent life as granted to it under the patent statutes.
I know there's some questions being raised out there. I think it's found its way into litigation as to whether Gilead knew back when it was developing TDF that the TAF opportunity might be a safer one. And I'm curious as to whether you were aware of the safety benefits associated with TAF at the time when TDF was being developed.
Absolutely not. I mean, TAF was still in the very early stages.
Okay.
We pursued the development of that for treatment and for prevention in line with the natural course of development.
Dr. Lord, do you feel?
Yeah, so we know that Gilead in 2011, the ex-CEO actually said that they stopped the development of the safer TAF drug because they knew it was not as safe, and when they were trying to launch Truvada versus another drug, Epsicom at the time, and this is a quote, they said, and to have our own study suggesting that Viriad, which is part of Truvada, wasn't the safest thing on the market, which it certainly was at a time, it didn't seem like the best. So we have evidence from their CEO that they purposely delayed development of the safer drug.
I appreciate that, and it's obviously going to play itself out. I mean, the courts will decide, I guess, whether these allegations are well-founded or not. But it is interesting that the effect of this is that with the new Descovy TAF-based drug that's coming, you're going to get another period of exclusivity. So am I right that essentially what's being achieved there is that by first pursuing the TDF-based Truvada with apparently these safety risks, and now pursuing the safer TAF-based drug of Descovy, basically Gilead is going to reap the benefit of 2 periods of exclusivity rather than 1. correct? I mean, that's just factual.
Well, these are two completely different medicines. This is
Right,
a step,
but
this is a step
I got you.
change in innovation.
That's going to be subject to debate and whatever, but you are going to get a period of exclusivity, which we're still in, for the TDF-based Truvada, and then you're going to get another period, if this all works out for you, of exclusivity for the TAF-based Descovy. That's how it looks to me. I got to move on real quick to one other series of questions I wanted to ask you. I understand that Teva Pharmaceutical got FDA approval for generic equivalent for Truvada back in June of 2017. And so it raises a question, if that generic drug was approved in 17, why did it not enter the market in 17? And apparently the answer is that 3 years previously, in 14, Gilead had entered into a settlement agreement with Teva, under the terms of which Teva agreed not to challenge Gilead's patents in court. And so in exchange, Gilead allowed Teva to come to the market in 2020, which is a year earlier. So you made this deal with them that basically said, we'll let you come in a year earlier if you, I gather, don't sue us on the patent. And maybe that you saw some weakness there, and this was a good deal to make. But is that true that there's some agreement that was made there with Teva where they're going to be able to come in a year earlier in return for something that was done? Is that true?
So this is a fairly normal process of generics coming in, challenging patents, and then a determination is eventually made on the cost of litigation, the potential litigation. We believe strongly in the Truvada patent. At the end of the day,
it is pretty typical. You're right about that, and you've done it in, I think, 9 other instances, the effect of which, there's all these ways to extend your patent control. One is pay for delay. This is a little bit different. This is making a deal, basically, so people won't challenge the patent, which to me signals maybe some concerns about the weakness of the patent, but you figured out a way to push that off. So it just makes me concerned about how you're conducting the business, because the bottom line is these generics don't get to the market as quickly as they could. Now, I understand from Dr. Walensky that the benefits of that in terms of the pricing may not be as much as we fantasize about, but nevertheless, it's important that the generics be able to get to market quickly, or as quickly as they can, and we're seeing some maneuvers on your part, I believe, that keeps that from happening. With that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. At the outset, it's important for me to disclose that Gilead is a company in my district with 9,000 employees around the world, many of them in my district. Having said that, Mr. O'Day, I'm glad that you are here. I'm glad that you've participated in the manner that you have. I think you do have a responsibility to your shareholders. I also think you have a responsibility to our country. And you are doing what you're doing in large part, and I agree with Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, because the system allows you to do it. And we have got to take responsibility for the fact that when Medicare Part D was created, we tied our hands behind our backs and did not allow Congress or the government to negotiate prescription drug discounts. Now, I am deeply concerned about the 1.1 million people that Dr. Walensky talked about who warrant PrEP right now. They are those most susceptible to potentially getting HIV. But only 150,000 of those 1.1 million people actually do, and of those, they're 75% white. So the people that desperately need this drug are African American gay men. 1 in 2 black gay men will be diagnosed with HIV in their lifetime. So, knowing all this, I want to know, and here I am negotiating with you in public over something, frankly, the government should have been doing a long time ago. Are you willing to provide PR ads? You put lots of ads on TV. I see them all the time for your drugs. Will you put ads on TV that are targeted at the African American gay men who should be getting this drug and who are not, and make them also aware of the fact that you are making available this drug for free to those who need it?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Just to clarify, the numbers that we have are around 200,000 people are on, of the 1.1 million are on Truvada today. There's clearly a huge unmet medical need, to your point. And again, the CDC's own study suggests that with the Gilead support programs, there's only 1% that aren't it for financial means. We are firmly committed to working in a number of ways to outreach.
Mr. O'Day, I don't have a lot of time.
Right.
Will you commit to developing a PR campaign for TV to target the African American population that is most susceptible to getting HIV and making them aware that the drug is available and it will be made available to them for free?
We do television advertising today for this community. We do digital advertising. We commit.
It's not working.
We commit to a variety of programs that are getting at this community today, and it is increasing, but there's much, much more to do, which is why the CDC initiative, which it's their numbers that suggest that 200,000 people are uninsured of this 1.1 million, and we're providing the total amount to make sure that we get that to patients.
But
and we'll
if the
continue
people
to work.
don't know about it, it doesn't matter that you're making 200,000 doses or enough for 200,000 people. If they don't know about it, they're not going to access it. So
right.
I feel that you have a moral obligation to inform that population. We have to save these lives. We do know that HIV is increasing because young gays, particularly in my district, are feeling immortal now, and since this disease is becoming chronic, that they can engage in unprotected sex, and so HIV is on the increase. So as the biggest provider of the drug that protects these individuals, I believe you have to do more, and I'm asking you to do more.
Yes, and we will continue to do more. We spend more than $100 million over a 10-year period on a COMPASS program that specifically targets sort of the southern states in the United States, that focuses on education, that focus on access to health care, and we'll continue to roll up our sleeves and work with the community and work with other organizations to be able to increase this presence. Absolutely, we commit to that.
It's obviously not working, though, and this donation really is not any meaningfully different than their medication access program, which they already have, which, as you say, is not working. It's only reaching, as Mr. O'Day said, 20,000 people.
So, Dr. Lord, what would you recommend?
I would recommend that they lower the price. That they lower the price so that Mr. Horn's organizations can get drugs to the people that need them. Instead of spending $2.6 billion, which is the domestic spend, on Truvada, I say we spend that money to develop programs for Mr. Horn's agencies to get drugs to these people that need it. They don't just need free drug, they need programs. And we're not going to do that with a donation. We're going to do that when we spend serious money, instead of sending it to Gilead, to giving it to the states, to the counties and municipalities that need it.
And Gilead is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these programs.
We're spending $2.6 billion. So, yeah, you give us a few $100 million back, but we're giving you the vast majority of that to begin with.
All right, my time has expired, but Mr. O'Day, I hope that you will take my request seriously and come back to us with a campaign that will engage a whole community that's not aware that your program exists. I yield back.
Want to be effective and efficient. Is there any agency that can identify who these people are that need this treatment, Dr. Walensky? In other words, can we pinpoint them? I mean, who they are? You follow me?
Yes,
In other words, you can go straight to them.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I want to go back to a number that keeps getting cited. That is 98% of people get access, and 1% of people don't cite cost as the issue. Less than 1% of people don't take cost as the issue. That was a study that was funded by the CDC. It was conducted by the CDC. It was a household survey. So we know that adults who are surveyed in the household don't think that they have a problem accessing PrEP. Well, I can tell you what, those are not the people who actually need access to PrEP. We know that of our youth that about 10% of our youth are gay. We know that of our homeless youth, 40% of them are gay. And you know what? They're not filling out household surveys. So I think part of the challenge with access to PrEP is that these folks are not easily coming forward. When we talk about gay black men, they don't have a good reason to come forward. And I can promise you that teenagers and 20-year-old gay men are not accessing health care. They just don't come to the doctor.
How can we reach them? How do you...
I think we need to decrease stigma. I think we need to have advertising. I think we need to open our doors to these people so that they will come welcomed and loved and access these drugs and come quarterly. So I know the other statistics that's been thrown out is 200,000 people are currently on PrEP. 200,000 people have ever been on PrEP. We learned at the HIV meetings in March, 34% of people don't take it for longer than a year.
And Mr. Horn?
Thank you. So we've been really discussing cost as a considerable factor here, and cost does remain a key issue here. But I think when we sort of open that up a little bit, we really have to talk about really sort of financing sustainable healthcare systems for the individuals that we're trying to reach here. And I just do want to circle back on one thing here. I think that the hearings it sort of descended to some acrimony around that we're against profit, and that Gilead is the enemy. Neither is true. Neither is true in that. And I am surrounded by activists, by clinicians, by academics, by policy leaders who have all fought tooth and nail with health insurance companies, with Medicaid, to make sure that Truvada was covered. However, what that comes back to is the issue of cost. And even with the copay assistance program, again, that has really been elementary in just ensuring access there. But it really does come down to an issue of cost as to why those programs are even necessary in the first place. So we're all in this together. We're all looking for solutions here. We don't have one good guy, we don't have one enemy. We really have to think about our entire system and how cost manifests across that entire system, and what are we going to do about that going forward. Thank you.
Mr. O'Day, do your board, I know it may be out of the ordinary, but does your board ever hear from people like Dr. Walensky and Mr. Horn?
Well, as you know, I just joined a couple of months ago, so I don't know the past practices of the board.
I was just wondering.
But I think the voice of the patient and voice of the community is represented in the company in very, very meaningful and serious ways. There's many, many community leaders that have joined Gilead, many HIV top physicians that are now part of Gilead. It is a part of the fabric of Gilead if you allow me, in my 2.5 months, Mr. Chairman, that you feel very connected with all aspects of the continuum of care here. And people take it very seriously. I mean, our role is to develop the next transformational medicine, but it's also to work as a member of this community in a very responsible way.
Finally, where are the negotiations with the CDC? Where are they right now? I mean, you did the 200,000. Is that ongoing? You following?
Well, yeah, I mean, the details of the program, how to implement it, those are all now ongoing. The commitment is clear, and as you said before, I mean, I think we would respond to other requests for the commitment, but now we're working through the details and trying to get it implemented as quickly as we can.
Ms. Jordan?
I would just thank our panel, and again, thank Gilead for the amazing drug that they developed and the difference it has made for, as I said earlier, millions of people around the world.
Without objection, letters the committee has received about this issue are entered into the hearing record from a number of organizations, including the Treatment Action Group, the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition, and the HIV Medicine Association. All of these groups have written to express their concerns about the impact that the high price of Truvada is having on their members, their communities, and the American healthcare system. I'd also like to thank Our witnesses for testifying today, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, and they should be submitted to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you possibly can when you receive those written questions. With that, the hearing is adjourned.